Hey guys, tonight we're settling into something deliciously strange. A journey back into the smoky, dimly lit chambers of medieval nights, where people were burning herbs you've probably never heard of, in ways that would definitely make your modern wellness Instagram influencer raise an eyebrow. Picture this. It's somewhere between the 5th and 15th centuries, the sun's gone down, and instead of reaching for their phones, medieval folks are lighting dried plants on fire, inhaling the smoke and hoping it'll either cure their plague or at least help them sleep without dreaming about their lord's taxes. You probably won't survive a night in an actual medieval bedroom. The smell alone would knock you sideways, and that's before we even talk about what they were actually smoking. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know, where are you right now, and what time is it where you're watching this? Drop your location and local time in the comments. It's oddly comforting knowing you're scattered across the globe, all tuning in at different hours, all about to drift off to some very weird historical facts. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So here's the thing about medieval people and sleep. They didn't have melatonin gummies. They didn't have white noise machines. They didn't even have reliable electric lighting, which meant their circadian rhythms were absolutely hammered by the constant darkness, the cold, the noise of animals outside, and the very real anxiety of living in a time when disease could wipe out your entire village before breakfast. Sleep was precious, rare, and often came with nightmares that felt weirdly real, sometimes too real, which is where our strange herbs come in. Medieval people smoked herbs at night for reasons that actually make sense when you think about it. They wanted to sleep, they wanted medicine, they wanted to feel less terrified of the dark, and they wanted to keep bugs away from their faces while they tried to rest. The herbs they used were often the same ones they'd grown in monastery gardens, or bought from travelling merchants who'd picked them up from even stranger places. Some of these herbs actually worked. Some of them were basically placebos wrapped in a lot of smoke and hope. And some of them were so hallucinogenic that we're still not entirely sure whether medieval people were actually healing themselves or just having really elaborate acid trips in the dark. What's fascinating is that this wasn't some fringe behaviour. This was mainstream. Kings did it, peasants did it, monks definitely did it. And if you'd somehow time-travelled back to a medieval bedroom, you'd think you'd walked into a concert venue from the 1960s, except everyone's wearing wool and nobody's having fun. The smoke was just there, hanging in the air, mixing with the smoke from the fire, the smoke from the rushes they use for light, and whatever else was burning. Your eyes would water, your throat would burn, and somewhere in that haze, medieval people genuinely believed they were getting healthier. One mainstream historical fact worth knowing right now: monasteries across Europe kept detailed records of the herbs they cultivated, and many of those records explicitly mention nighttime use, burning them, steeping them, or stuffing them into pillows. These weren't secret practices, they were documented, prescribed, and considered part of basic medicine. Here's a quirky detail that'll stick with you. Some medieval texts refer to certain herbs as night plants, which was the medieval way of saying stuff that makes you feel weird and might help you sleep, or might make you see things. There's actually no clear distinction in the old manuscripts between medicinal and hallucinogenic, partly because medieval people weren't entirely sure there was a difference, and partly because if something made you sleep, who cared if you had to hallucinate a little bit first? Historians still argue whether medieval herb use was based on genuine pharmacological understanding or pure superstition, but what we know now is that many of these plants do contain psychoactive compounds that absolutely would affect your brain and body. So our ancestors weren't entirely wrong, even if they didn't understand the mechanisms. The medieval night was fundamentally different from your night. There were no streetlights, there were no alarm clocks, there was no concept of a good sleep schedule, because nobody had the luxury of consistency. You slept when you could, where you could, and you did whatever it took to make that happen. Enter the herbs. Lots and lots of smoke, filling the air, entering your lungs, hopefully carrying you towards sleep before the rooster decided it was time to wake up and scream at everyone. We're going to walk through these herbs one by one, meet the people who are selling them, understand why they were burning them, and figure out whether our ancestors were genuinely onto something or just really committed to self-medication in the dark. You're lying in a medieval bed now, and bed is a generous term. It's probably a straw mattress, maybe some hay, definitely full of things you don't want to think about. There's a small window with wooden shutters, and they're closed because it's night and the world outside is genuinely dangerous. A candle flickers somewhere, but not near you. Candles were expensive, so there's probably just a rushlight. A stick dipped in animal fat that smells exactly like you'd think it smells. The air is already thick before anyone even lights an herb. This is your medieval bedroom, and it's about to get a lot weirder. Someone, maybe your servant, maybe you yourself if you're wealthy enough to have herbs, strikes a spark and touches it to dried plant material. It catches. The smoke rises, and within seconds the entire room transforms into something that feels less like a bedroom and more like the waiting room outside a fever dream. The smell hits you first. It's not unpleasant necessarily, but it's present. It's assertive. It demands your attention even as you're trying to drift off to sleep. There's an herbal quality to it. Green, sometimes earthy, sometimes sharp, mixed with the underlying scent of wood smoke and burning plant matter. If you've ever stood too close to a bonfire that someone decided to throw herbs onto, you have a faint idea of what this is like. Except this is indoors, in your bedroom, where you're supposed to be sleeping. The smoke doesn't rise neatly like in those aesthetic Instagram videos of people burning sage in their minimalist apartments. No, this smoke curls and hangs and settles into every corner. It gets into your hair. It coats your throat. It makes your eyes water slightly, which is not ideal when you're trying to sleep. But medieval people were committed to their practices, so they just accepted the watery eyes as part of the treatment. The smoke catches the candlelight, or rushlight, or firelight from the main room if you're sleeping somewhere with access to a hearth. And you can actually see it now, thick and visible, drifting through the darkness like some kind of supernatural presence, which, to be fair, medieval people sometimes thought it was. What's interesting is that the smoke wasn't just in the wealthy bedrooms. Sure, nobles got better quality herbs, more fragrant ones, possibly ones that were more likely to actually help them sleep. But even peasants in their single-room hovels were doing this. They might not have had mandrake or henbane, those were expensive, but they had mugwort, they had sage, they had whatever they could grow or afford. The principle was the same. Light it, let it burn, breathe it in, hope for sleep. The difference was that a peasant's hovel was so small that the smoke would fill the entire space within minutes, creating an almost suffocating cloud that everyone inside had to navigate. A noble's bedroom at least had higher ceilings and better ventilation. The physical sensations you're experiencing in this medieval bedroom were actually pretty important to understanding why people did this. First, there's the respiratory effect. Smoke is irritating. It makes you cough a little, which brings up phlegm, which medieval people thought was clearing out the bad humours from your chest. Modern medicine would call this ineffective at best and harmful at worst, but the sensation of coughing something up creates a feeling of doing something. In a time when most medical interventions consisted of prayer and hope, the act of physically coughing felt like progress. You're taking an active role in your own health. The smoke is literally inside you, doing something, changing something. That feeling matters. Second, there's the chemical effect on your nervous system. Many of these herbs contain compounds that actually are sedating or mildly psychoactive. So your lungs are absorbing these compounds, your bloodstream is processing them, and your brain is genuinely starting to feel different. The effect might be subtle. You might just feel slightly drowsy, slightly disconnected, or it might be dramatic depending on the herb and the dose. Either way, you're experiencing something real. Your pupils might dilate. Your perception of time might get a little fuzzy. The boundaries between reality and imagination start to blur. And in the darkness, with smoke swirling around you, that blur feels mystical. That blur feels like medicine. That blur feels like the herbs are working. Third, there's the psychological component. You've been told your entire life, by healers, by monks, by neighbours, by anyone with any social authority, that this herb smoke will help you sleep. You've probably watched other people do it. You've heard stories about how well it works. You have a whole framework of belief wrapped around this practice. So when you lie down, the smoke rises around you, and your brain is primed to feel sleepy. Placebo is real, and in a time before placebos had a name, it was doing a lot of heavy lifting in the medieval medicine cabinet. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval medical texts, particularly those translated from Islamic and Greek sources, explicitly recommend the burning of herbs in bedrooms as a standard treatment for insomnia and various ailments. This wasn't folklore. It was learned medicine, written down by educated physicians, approved by the church, mostly, and considered sophisticated treatment. A quirky detail: some medieval people would hang entire bundles of dried herbs above their beds, letting them dry further in the warmth of their body and the room, which meant they were constantly releasing small amounts of volatile oils into the air they were breathing. It's like the Victorian version of a diffuser, except less controlled and more whatever happens, happens. Historians still argue whether the medicinal properties of these herbs were effective enough to justify their use, or whether medieval people were essentially just getting placebo effects enhanced by low-grade hallucinations and then calling it medicine. But what's undeniable is that medieval bedrooms were fundamentally different sensory experiences from modern ones. Thicker with smoke, heavier with smell, more saturated with herbal presence. You were breathing in these plants whether you wanted to or not. Let's talk about why medieval people were burning herbs at night in the first place, because it wasn't random. It wasn't just that they liked the smell or wanted to seem mysterious. There were actual practical desperate reasons why someone would light dried plants on fire in their bedroom before trying to sleep, and understanding those reasons is key to understanding why they were willing to live in rooms that constantly smelled like a medieval apothecary exploded. First, and most obvious, medicine. Medieval people got sick constantly. They had no antibiotics, no vaccines, no understanding of germ theory. They had no way to know that the water they were drinking might be contaminated, or that the rat living in the walls was spreading disease, or that the person coughing next to them was about to infect half the village. What they did have was experience. Over centuries, people had noticed that certain herbs seemed to help with certain symptoms. Cough? Burn this. Fever? Drink that. Can't sleep? Smoke this other thing. Much of this medicine was placebo, sure, but some of it was actually pharmacologically active. Some of these herbs genuinely do contain compounds that affect the human body. So when you were sick and couldn't sleep, burning an herb that contained actual sedative compounds made a real difference. Not a huge difference probably, but enough that you'd sleep a little better, and that felt miraculous when your alternative was a night of fever dreams and coughing. Second reason, equally important, pest control. Medieval bedrooms were infested. Not metaphorically, actually infested. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, mosquitoes, all kinds of parasites that would make your skin crawl just thinking about them. These weren't minor annoyances. They were constant sources of infection, itching and disease transmission. So when someone burned certain herbs, ones that had insecticide properties, they weren't just creating ambience. They were literally trying to kill the bugs that were feeding on them while they slept. Some herbs like sage, wormwood, and mugwort have actual insecticidal properties. The smoke would irritate the insects' respiratory systems and drive them away, or kill them outright. From a medieval person's perspective, this was a game changer. Fewer bugs meant fewer bites, meant less infection, meant a better night's sleep. The fact that the herb smoke was also mildly toxic to you, the human, was just something you had to accept. It was either breathe in the smoke or let the parasites eat you alive. Medieval healthcare was full of these kinds of choices. Third reason, spiritual cleansing. Medieval Christianity was absolutely dominant, and the church had a lot to say about demons, spiritual contamination, and the importance of keeping evil at bay. Many of these herbs had religious significance. Sage was used in blessing rituals. Incense, which included various herbs, was part of church services. There was a genuine belief that certain plants had spiritual properties, that they could purify a space, that they could protect you from spiritual harm while you slept. Was this scientifically accurate? No. Was it psychologically useful? Actually, maybe. If you believed you were protected, you might sleep better. You might feel less anxious about the dark. You might not wake up screaming at shadows. In a world where the greatest threats were not just physical, but spiritual, as medieval people understood it, having a spiritual defense mechanism made sense. Fourth reason, managing the smell of the bedroom itself. Medieval bedrooms smelled bad. There was no indoor plumbing. People didn't bathe regularly. There was a chamber pot for nighttime bathroom needs, which definitely was not emptied constantly. There were animals nearby. There was mould, damp, decay, unwashed bodies, and the general funk of human existence crammed into a small space with poor ventilation. Burning herbs was one way to mask these smells. Was it effective? Kind of. You're replacing one smell, the smell of human waste and decay, with another smell, the smell of burning plants, which is arguably not an improvement. But psychologically, an herb smell feels cleaner, more medicinal, more intentional than the raw smell of bodily functions. So medieval people lit herbs to convince themselves, and anyone else who might notice, that their bedroom was a place of health and cleanliness rather than a chamber of human decay. Fifth reason, the pure desperation of insomnia. Medieval people suffered from sleep deprivation. Historians still argue about exactly how much sleep medieval people got, and how their sleep patterns differed from ours, but what's clear is that getting a full, uninterrupted night of sleep was not guaranteed. Between cold, hunger, noise, anxiety, illness, and the simple fact that their lives were objectively terrible by modern standards, medieval people were tired and desperate. When you're desperate enough, you'll try anything. You'll breathe smoke, you'll drink weird teas, you'll pray to saints, you'll do whatever it takes, because the alternative, lying awake all night, alone with your thoughts in the dark, was psychologically unbearable. The herbs were a way to take control, to do something active toward the goal of sleep. Even if they didn't work that well, the act of burning them, the ritual of it, might have been enough to calm your mind enough to sleep. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval physicians, influenced by Galenic humoral theory, believed that various illnesses were caused by imbalances in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Burning certain herbs was thought to release their essences into the air, which would then be inhaled and would help rebalance these humours. This was considered sophisticated medical theory at the time, taught in universities and applied by educated physicians, a quirky detail that deserves mention. Some medieval herbalists believed that the smoke of a plant was actually more potent than the plant itself, because smoke was thought to carry the spirit, or essential nature of the plant. So burning an herb was, in their minds, more effective than eating it or making a tea from it. This belief led to a lot of burning of herbs that probably didn't taste great but smelled interesting. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was fundamentally a system of placebo and superstition, or whether it contained enough empirical knowledge accumulated through centuries of trial and error to be considered a legitimate medical practice. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Some herbs worked, some didn't, and the medieval understanding of why was usually wrong, even when the practice was right. So when you're lying in that medieval bed and the smoke is rising around you, you need to understand that every breath you're taking is part of a desperate, multifaceted attempt to solve real problems. Disease, parasites, spiritual danger, unbearable smell, and the crushing weight of insomnia. The medieval person lighting that herb wasn't being romantic or mystical. They were being practical, even if that practicality was based on a completely different understanding of medicine and the world than we have now. Now we come to Mandrake, and this is where things start getting genuinely strange. Mandrake was the rock star of medieval herbs. Famous, legendary, feared, and absolutely surrounded by more myth than most plants deserved. If medieval herbalism had celebrity scandals, Mandrake would be the subject of them. People whispered about Mandrake, they told stories, they did elaborate rituals just to harvest it. And the reason they were so obsessed with it, despite or because of its reputation, is that Mandrake might have been one of the few medieval herbs that genuinely did something powerful to your consciousness. Let's start with what Mandrake actually is. It's a plant with a root system that, if you squint and use your imagination, sort of looks like a human figure. It has a thick taproot that can fork into what looks like legs. It has small branches that vaguely resemble arms. If you're medieval and you believe that plants can have magical properties hidden inside them, a root that looks like a tiny human is basically screaming, "I'm magic." It's the kind of thing that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And medieval people definitely saw it. They saw it, they got excited, they started telling stories, and those stories took on a life of their own. The Mandrake story that captured medieval imagination was the Screaming Mandrake legend. According to this mythology, if you tried to pull a mandrake root out of the ground, the plant would scream. Actually scream. A sound of such terrible power that anyone who heard it would either die instantly or go insane. Therefore, harvesting mandrake required an elaborate ritual. You couldn't just dig it up. You'd bring a dog, or in some versions a virgin, which raises questions about medieval culture that we probably shouldn't explore too deeply. You'd tie the dog to the plant, you'd chant some kind of blessing or spell. There were many variations. Then you'd leave, covering your ears or running away, and the dog would pull up the root, presumably while screaming in canine agony, and the plant would emit its terrible scream, but at least you weren't there to hear it, so you'd survive. Was any of this true? No. There's no evidence that mandrake roots scream. But here's what's fascinating. There's a plausible explanation for why medieval people believed this story. Mandrake contains several alkaloid compounds, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine, which are psychoactive and hallucinogenic. If you're harvesting mandrake and you're breathing in dust from the roots, or if you've already ingested some of the plant and you're hallucinating, the experience could absolutely feel like the plant is screaming at you. You might hear things that aren't there. You might feel overwhelming dread or euphoria. You might be convinced you've encountered something supernatural. And if you're passing this story on, I tried to dig up mandrake and it screamed at me. Your listeners have no reason to doubt you. They don't understand pharmacology. They understand that you encountered something powerful and frightening, therefore the plant must scream. Mandrake's reputation as a nighttime plant was partly due to these hallucinogenic properties. Medieval people who used mandrake, and some definitely did, despite the danger and the elaborate mythology, would experience something genuinely altered. They might sleep, yes, but they'd sleep while hallucinating. They'd have strange dreams. They'd wake up feeling like they'd been on a journey to another world. And to someone who didn't understand hallucinogens, that would feel like proof of the plant's power. They'd assume the plant was doing something mystical, something spiritual, something beyond normal understanding. The fact that it was just messing with their brain chemistry, well, medieval people didn't have a concept for that, so it just confirmed the magic. The use of mandrake in medieval nighttime routines was complicated. Some people would burn it, inhaling the smoke and the alkaloid compounds it released. Some would make an extract and apply it to the skin, which could absorb through the skin, especially if there were any cuts or abrasions. Some would make a tea, though this was incredibly dangerous because the alkaloid content varied wildly depending on which part of the plant you used and how you prepared it. A dose that helped you sleep could become a dose that poisoned you, and there was no way to know the difference until you'd already taken it. Medieval people knew this was risky. Some herbals actually warned against using mandrake, or recommended it only in the smallest possible doses, or suggested it should be reserved for only the most desperate situations, but people used it anyway. Why? Because the effect was real. Because even if you had a 50-50 chance of either sleeping deeply, or hallucinating intensely, or possibly dying, sometimes that seemed better than the alternative of lying awake all night. Because medieval nighttime was terrifying, and if a plant could transform that terror into something else, even something strange and hallucinatory, maybe that was worth the risk. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Mandrake appears in medical texts from ancient times through the medieval period and beyond, always mentioned as a powerful plant with significant dangers. Medieval physicians knew it was potent, they documented its risks, and they continue to recommend it anyway, which tells you something about how desperate medieval people were for sleep. A quirky detail, some medieval texts describe mandrake as being most powerful if harvested under specific astrological conditions during a full moon, or when certain planets were in certain positions. There's no pharmacological basis for this, but it's a good example of how medieval people thought about timing and ritual. They believed that when you harvested, something mattered as much as what you harvested. Historians still argue whether medieval people who reported being cured by mandrake were actually experiencing placebo effects enhanced by hallucinations, or whether they were genuinely benefiting from the alkaloid's psychoactive properties in ways that we'd now recognise as affecting their brain chemistry. What's clear is that mandrake was not a gentle herb. It was powerful, it was dangerous, and medieval people treated it with both reverence and fear. The screaming root, the tiny human-shaped plant, the legendary hallucinogenic root that could kill you just by hearing it scream. All of this made mandrake the perfect symbol for medieval nighttime herbalism. It was exotic, it was dangerous, it was surrounded by ritual and legend, and it actually genuinely did something to your consciousness, which probably felt like magic when you didn't understand alkaloids and psychoactive compounds. In your medieval bed, breathing in the smoke of mandrake, if you were wealthy or desperate enough to use it, you were taking a genuine risk for the promise of an altered state that might feel like healing, or might feel like descending into another world entirely. Either way, you'd probably sleep. Word count 1154. Let's talk about henbane now, because henbane is what happens when you take mandrake's dangerous reputation and add paranoia to it. Henbane is maybe the most unforgiving herb in this entire medieval nighttime lineup. It's powerful, it's unpredictable, and it has a history of making medieval people extremely worried about whether they're healing themselves or slowly poisoning themselves, which, to be fair, they probably were doing both simultaneously. Henbane, your Skymus niger, if we're being scientific about it, contains the same alkaloids as mandrake, scopolamine and hyoscyamine primarily. These compounds are sedating at low doses, hallucinogenic at medium doses, and potentially fatal at high doses. The problem is that the alkaloid concentration in henbane plants varies wildly depending on growing conditions, soil composition, time of harvest, and about 50 other factors that medieval people couldn't possibly control or measure. So when you harvested henbane and prepared it for burning or smoking, you had absolutely no way of knowing whether you were about to have a gentle sleepy evening or an intense hallucinogenic experience, or fall into an unconscious state from which you might not wake up. Medieval people knew this. They weren't stupid. The herbals and medical texts of the period are absolutely full of warnings about henbane. Use with caution. Very dangerous. Should be used only in the smallest doses. Can cause death. These aren't casual warnings, these are physicians and herbalists saying, this plant will kill you if you're not careful, but also it kind of works, so use it anyway. There's a resigned quality to some of the historical text about henbane, as if the writers understood that people were going to use it regardless of the warnings, so they might as well provide instructions that might, possibly, prevent the worst outcomes. The thing about henbane is that its effects are genuinely unpredictable in a way that's different from mandrake. Mandrake tends to produce a similar type of experience each time: intense hallucination, sense of otherworldliness, sometimes terror, sometimes euphoria. Henbane is all over the place. One dose might put you to sleep for hours. The next dose, prepared from the same plant at the same time of year, might produce intense anxiety and paranoia. A third dose might cause complete unconsciousness. A fourth might kill you. There's a story, probably apocryphal, but repeated in various medieval texts, of a woman who used henbane for sleep and woke up 3 days later, unable to remember anything, feeling like she'd been transported to another world entirely. Was that henbane, or was that the medieval equivalent of telling ghost stories? Probably both. So why did medieval people use it? The same reason they used mandrake, because they were desperate, because insomnia was ruining their lives, because the alternative to sleeping was lying awake in the dark, anxious and cold and aware of every danger lurking in the shadows, real and imagined. And because henbane, when it worked, actually worked. It didn't just help you fall asleep, it could put you into a deep, profound sleep from which nothing could wake you. If you were working a physically exhausting job, if you were recovering from an illness, if you were genuinely sleep deprived to the point of hallucinating anyway, a drug that could force you into unconsciousness might seem like exactly what you needed. Risks be damned. Medieval people prepared henbane in various ways. Some would burn it and inhale the smoke, which was actually somewhat safer than ingesting it because you had more control over the dose. You'd get drowsy, stop smoking and go to sleep. Some would make a tea, which was incredibly risky because there was no way to know how much alkaloid you were getting. Some would make an ointment or salve and rub it on their skin, which allowed for some absorption through the skin. Some would stuff dried henbane into pillows, banking on the idea that sleeping on a pillow full of a hallucinogenic plant would produce good results. This was probably not a great idea, but medieval people tried it anyway. The paranoia aspect of henbane use is worth dwelling on. Some medieval people reported that after using henbane, they felt paranoid, convinced that something bad was about to happen, that people were plotting against them, that the world was more dangerous than they'd realized. This is actually a documented effect of scopolamine and hyoscyamine. They can produce paranoid ideation, especially in certain individuals or at certain doses. So a medieval person using henbane might sleep, but they'd sleep while their brain was generating genuine paranoia. They might wake up convinced they'd been trapped in a malevolent world. And since they didn't understand pharmacology, they might interpret this paranoia as insight, as the plant having shown them something true about reality. This paranoia also contributed to another phenomenon: accusations of witchcraft. If your neighbour was known to use henbane, and if people occasionally saw them acting strangely, or heard them talking about paranoid delusions, it was easy to conclude that they were possessed by demons or practicing witchcraft. The herb was making them seem supernatural, and that appearance of the supernatural could be dangerous. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Henbane was used in medieval medicine, documented in texts, and recommended by educated physicians despite its obvious dangers. It appears in texts like the leechdoms and in various monastic herbals, always with warnings, always with acknowledgements of risk. A quirky detail: henbane was sometimes added to beer in medieval times, before hops became the standard bittering agent. This means medieval people were potentially getting random doses of hallucinogens in their everyday beverages without quite realizing it. Or maybe they did realize it, and that was part of the appeal. Either way, medieval beer was probably a lot more interesting, and more dangerous, than modern beer. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval bewitchment accusations were actually describing the effects of hallucinogenic plants like henbane. Some scholars suggest that many accused witches were actually just people using medicinal herbs, whose side effects made them seem possessed or strange. Others argue this is anachronistic, projecting modern drug knowledge onto medieval supernatural beliefs. But the possibility is tantalizing. How many medieval people were persecuted for witchcraft when what they were actually guilty of was using a plant with unpredictable side effects? The experience of using henbane for sleep was probably this. You'd burn it or ingest it. You'd feel drowsy pretty quickly. The alkaloids work fast. Then you'd either fall into normal sleep, lucky you, or you'd drift into a strange, paranoid, hallucinatory state where your thoughts didn't quite feel like they belonged to you. You might feel intense anxiety. You might see things. You might feel convinced that something terrible was about to happen, even though objectively nothing was happening at all. Eventually, hopefully, you'd fall into unconsciousness. You'd sleep hard, probably with vivid nightmares, and then you'd wake up feeling like you'd been on a journey to somewhere dark. You might feel grateful to have survived it. You might swear never to use it again, and you might use it again next week because at least it solved the immediate problem of insomnia, even if it created a different problem, intense paranoia and fear in the process. This is what medieval nighttime medicine was like. A constant negotiation between desperation and danger, between the promise of sleep and the risk of something worse. Henbane embodied that negotiation perfectly. It could help, it could hurt, and there was no way to know which it would be until you'd already taken it. Mugwort is where things start getting slightly less terrifying and slightly more interesting in a way that appeals specifically to the medieval obsession with dreams. If mandrake was the dangerous herb and henbane was the unpredictable herb, mugwort was the dream herb, the plant that was supposed to unlock your subconscious, give you lucid dreams, and help you access knowledge that was normally hidden from you during waking hours. Mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, is a pretty common plant. You can find it in temperate regions all over the world. It's not rare or exotic or particularly difficult to grow or harvest. Medieval herbalists loved it partly because it was accessible, and partly because it had such an interesting reputation. Unlike mandrake's terrifying mythology, or henbane's reputation for unpredictability, mugwort had this almost romantic cultural baggage. It was associated with dreams, with magic, with the ability to see things that were normally hidden. The way medieval people used mugwort at night was often relatively gentle compared to mandrake or henbane. They'd hang dried bundles above the bed, sometimes placing them directly under the pillow. They'd burn it as incense in the bedroom. Some would make a tea and drink it before bed. A few bold individuals would smoke it, inhaling the smoke to get a more direct dose of whatever compounds it contained. The idea behind all of this was the same. Mugwort would help you access your dreams, help you remember your dreams, and potentially help you have lucid dreams, dreams in which you could control what was happening and be aware that you were dreaming. Does this actually work? Sort of. Mugwort contains compounds, thujon is the main one, that are psychoactive, though not in the dramatic hallucinatory way that mandrake or henbane are. Thujon affects your nervous system in subtle ways. It might make you more aware during sleep. It might make your dreams more vivid. It might affect your sleep architecture in ways that make you more likely to remember dreams or to have lucid dreams. Or honestly, it might just be placebo. You expect mugwort to make your dreams interesting, so your brain creates more interesting dreams because you're in that mindset. The effect is real. You do remember more dreams, but the cause might be expectation rather than pharmacology. Medieval people didn't distinguish between these possibilities. To them, if mugwort made your dreams more interesting, it was working, and they had a framework for understanding why this was useful. Dreams were messages from God or from spirits or from your subconscious. If mugwort helped you access your dreams, it was giving you access to information that was normally hidden from you. This was valuable. This was worth doing. There's something appealing about mugwort compared to the other herbs we've discussed. It's not terrifying. It doesn't have an elaborate mythology about screaming roots or deadly doses. It's just a plant that makes your dreams a little bit more vivid, a little bit more memorable. Medieval people who wanted to use herbs for sleep but weren't quite brave enough to risk mandrake or henbane might reach for mugwort instead. It was a middle ground, more interesting than chamomile, less dangerous than the heavy hitters. Women in particular seemed to gravitate toward mugwort. Partly this was because women in medieval Europe had more control over herbal knowledge than men did. They managed the gardens, they managed the household medicine, they passed knowledge down through female relatives. Partly it was because mugwort had associations with women's health. It was used to help regulate menstruation. It was used to help with childbirth. It had a long history of being part of women's magical and medical knowledge. So when medieval women were dealing with sleep issues, mugwort was often the herb they'd reach for, partly because they had access to it and knowledge of it, and partly because it fit into the broader framework of women's herbal practice. The experience of using mugwort for sleep was probably this. You'd prepare it however you'd decided to, burned, smoked, in a tea, and you'd go to bed. The effects would be subtle. You might feel slightly drowsy, or you might just feel normal. You'd fall asleep. And then, in the middle of the night, something different would happen. Your dreams would become unusually vivid. You'd remember them more clearly than usual. You might have the strange experience of being aware within the dream that you were dreaming. You could potentially direct the dream, make it go the way you wanted, wake yourself up if things got too strange. This is lucid dreaming, and if mugwort actually made it easier to achieve, that would have felt genuinely magical to someone who'd never experienced it before. Suddenly, the night became less terrifying because you had more control over it. Even if you were asleep, you were still in some sense present and aware. Medieval people valued this. They kept dream journals. Well, people who could write kept dream journals. They consulted dream interpretation guides. Dreams were serious business in medieval culture. If you could remember your dreams better, if you could make your dreams more vivid and controllable, if you could use your dreams as a source of insight or guidance, that was genuinely useful knowledge to have. Mugwort promised to help with this, and it probably did, even if the mechanism was only partially based on the pharmacological properties of the plant. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Mugwort appears consistently in medieval herbals and medical texts as a plant specifically recommended for dream work and sleep. It's mentioned in texts across Europe and beyond, suggesting that its reputation as a dream herb was widespread and established. A quirky detail. In some medieval contexts, mugwort was referred to as a plant that could help you access magical knowledge or prophetic dreams. Some herbals hint that if you used mugwort properly, you might receive visions or insights from divine sources. This wasn't considered crazy. This was considered a plausible benefit of using the herb. Historians still argue about whether mugwort actually does increase dream vividness and lucidity, or whether medieval people were experiencing strong placebo effects combined with the power of expectation and suggestion. Modern scientific evidence suggests mugwort does have some effect on dreams, probably through the thujon content and its effects on the nervous system. But the effect is subtle enough that it's hard to separate from psychological factors. What's interesting about mugwort is that it represents a different approach to medieval nighttime herbalism. Instead of using herbs to try to escape sleep, or to numb yourself into unconsciousness, or to chemically force yourself into rest, mugwort was used to enhance sleep, to make it more interesting, to make it something you could engage with actively even while asleep. It's actually kind of sophisticated when you think about it. The recognition that sleep could be improved not just by making it easier to fall asleep, but by making it a richer, more meaningful experience. So in your medieval bed, with a bundle of mugwort under your pillow, you'd lie down and settle in, and you'd be quietly hopeful about what your dreams might bring. You'd be looking forward to the night in a way. You wouldn't have that anxious dread you'd feel before using mandrake, or the paranoid tension of henbane. You'd just have this gentle expectation that tonight your dreams would be interesting, that you might learn something, that the night would be something other than just the period of unconsciousness that had to happen before you could get back to work tomorrow. For medieval people living in constant anxiety and danger, that shift in perspective, that possibility of making the night mean something, of accessing knowledge through dreams, might have been worth as much as actually sleeping well. Valerian is the herb that makes you understand medieval people's commitment to their nighttime practices, because valerian smells absolutely terrible, and yet medieval people burned it, smoked it, made tea from it, and stuffed it into pillows anyway. If you can tolerate doing something that smells this bad, you must really, genuinely want the benefit you think it's going to provide. Valerian, Valeriana officinalis, is a plant with small white or pale pink flowers and roots that smell like, well, imagine if you took all the worst smells you can think of. Old socks, rotten vegetables, a cat's litter box, the smell of decay, and combined them into one concentrated odour. That's approximately what valerian smells like. Some people describe it as earthy. Some people describe it as musty. Most people describe it as making them want to gag. Medieval people, given a choice between putting a pleasant-smelling herb in their bedroom and putting valerian in their bedroom, would choose valerian, because valerian actually worked. The reason valerian actually worked is that it contains compounds, valerianic acid and other volatile oils, that genuinely have sedative properties. Unlike mugwort, which might work through placebo and expectation, valerian works through actual pharmacology. It affects your nervous system, it promotes relaxation, makes falling asleep easier. Medieval people didn't know this in pharmacological terms, but they knew it empirically. Use valerian, sleep better. It's one of the most reliable herbs in the entire medieval nighttime pharmacopoeia. The problem was the smell. Seriously, the smell was an issue. Medieval bedrooms already didn't smell great, but adding valerian to the mix was a sacrifice. You were trading one bad smell, the smell of human decay, chamber pots, animals, for a different bad smell, valerian, in hopes of sleep. It was a lose-lose from an olfactory perspective, but from a sleep perspective, it was a win, and medieval people were pragmatic enough to accept bad smells in exchange for actual functional sleep. How medieval people used valerian varied. Some would dry the roots and burn them, inhaling the smoke. This was actually pretty effective because the volatile oils would be released into the air, you'd breathe them in, and your nervous system would start to relax. Some would make a tea, boiling valerian roots in water, then drinking the tea before bed. This actually tastes worse than it smells, which is saying something, but it works fast. The compounds enter your system, you get drowsy, you sleep. Some would make a tincture, soaking valerian in alcohol, then taking a small dose. Some would stuff dried valerian into pillows or hang it above the bed, letting it release its oils slowly over time. The thing about valerian is that it's not hallucinogenic. It's not going to give you paranoid thoughts, or make you see things. It's not going to make your dreams unusually vivid or intense. It's just going to make you sleepy and relaxed. From a medieval perspective, this might have been less interesting than mandrake or henbane, which created dramatic experiences, but it was also much more reliable and much less likely to kill you. So there's an argument for valerian being the responsible choice for medieval people who just wanted to sleep without gambling with their lives. Medieval medical texts recognise valerian's effectiveness. It appears in herbals with descriptions of its sleep-promoting properties. There's no elaborate mythology around it, no legends of magical powers or supernatural effects. Just burn this and you'll sleep better. Very practical. Very unsexy compared to screaming mandrake roots, but very useful. The experience of using valerian for sleep was probably this. You'd prepare it however you'd chosen. The smell would immediately announce to everyone in the vicinity that you were doing something a little desperate. Your bedroom would smell objectively worse. You'd breathe in the smell, whether from burning it or from the pillow or from the tea you were drinking, and it would be unpleasant. Simultaneously, your nervous system would start to respond. You'd feel a gentle relaxation settling over your body. The tension in your muscles would decrease. Your mind would start to quiet down. Within maybe 20 minutes to an hour, you'd feel noticeably drowsy. You'd lie down, and sleep would come relatively easily. You'd sleep through the night, probably sleeping more soundly than you would have without valerian. You'd wake up the next morning not feeling hungover or paranoid or like you'd been on a journey to another world. You'd just feel rested. This is why valerian was such a staple despite its terrible smell. It was reliable. It was effective. It wasn't going to kill you. It might not be as exciting as some of the other herbs, but it would get the job done, and in medieval medicine, getting the job done mattered more than creating a mystical experience. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Valerian has been used as a sleep aid for thousands of years. It appears in Greek, Roman and medieval texts. Modern scientific studies confirm that it does have sedative properties and can help with sleep quality. It's one of the few medieval herbs that modern medicine has largely validated. A quirky detail. In some medieval contexts, valerian was combined with other herbs to create compound medicines. The idea was that combining the sedative effects of valerian with other herbs' properties might create a better overall effect. Whether this actually worked, or whether combining plants with different smells just created a worse smell overall is debatable. Historians still argue about which medieval herbs were most effective, but valerian is usually one that modern historians agree actually did something useful. The combination of medieval documentation, modern scientific validation, and the fact that valerian is still used today as a sleep aid all point to, yes, valerian genuinely helped medieval people sleep better. The acceptance of valerian's terrible smell tells us something about medieval priorities. You were willing to endure genuine discomfort, a bedroom that smelled disgusting, in exchange for the benefit of actual sleep. That's a trade medieval people were willing to make every single day. Sleep was worth living in a room that smelled like Satan's laundry basket. That's commitment to health and wellness that modern people, with our comfortable beds and lack of fleas, probably don't fully appreciate. Chamomile is where we get to talk about the one herb that was actually safe, actually effective, and actually not completely disgusting. Chamomile is the mild-mannered herb in a lineup of increasingly unhinged plants. It's the herb that a medieval person would use not because they were desperate, but because it was genuinely pleasant and it actually helped. This might not sound exciting compared to mandrake hallucinations or valerian's terrible smell, but in the medieval nighttime economy, safety and effectiveness were actually pretty valuable. Chamomile, Matricaria chamomilla, is a pretty little herb with small white flowers that look vaguely daisy-like. When you dry the flowers and steep them in hot water, you get a pale yellow tea that smells pleasant and tastes mild, slightly apple-like, not actively unpleasant. For medieval people, this was already a massive win. You weren't fighting through horrible smell or paranoid delusions or the fear that you might die. You were just having a nice tea. The reason chamomile was safe and effective is that its compounds, mainly apigenin, have documented sedative properties but not in a dramatic way. Chamomile won't knock you unconscious, it won't make you hallucinate, it won't give you paranoid thoughts. It will, however, make you feel slightly more relaxed, slightly more drowsy, and help you fall asleep a bit more easily than you would without it. The effect is gentle and reliable. It's probably why chamomile is still one of the most popular herbal sleep aids in the modern world. Medieval people used chamomile primarily as a tea, though some might have also made it into other preparations. You'd pick the flower heads, dry them, store them, and when you wanted to sleep better, you'd steep them in hot water and drink the tea before bed. The warmth of the tea itself would be comforting. Medieval bedrooms were cold, so a hot drink before bed was inherently appealing. The taste was acceptable, the smell was pleasant, and then you'd feel gently drowsy and sleep would come more easily than usual. What's interesting about chamomile is that it crosses social classes in a way that some other herbs didn't. Mandrake was expensive and dangerous, so it was mostly used by people wealthy enough to afford it, and desperate enough to risk it. Henbane required some knowledge to use safely, so it was more commonly used by herbalists and people with medical training. Valerian was so unpleasant that you only used it if other options weren't working. But chamomile was accessible. It could be grown in a simple garden. It didn't require special harvesting rituals. You didn't need training to use it safely, and it was actually pleasant to use. So medieval people across the social spectrum used chamomile for sleep. Nobles would have had access to the best chamomile, carefully grown, dried, maybe combined with other pleasant herbs. Peasants could grow it themselves or purchase it relatively cheaply from herbalists. Monasteries grew it in their herb gardens. It was everywhere, and everyone agreed it was good for sleep. This is actually pretty remarkable. In a time when different herbs had different reputations, when some herbs were thought to be suited to certain people and not others, chamomile was universal. Everyone agreed on chamomile. The experience of using chamomile for sleep was probably this. In the evening you'd heat some water, in a pot over the fire or wherever you heated water. You'd add dried chamomile flowers to a cup, pour the hot water over them, and let them steep for a few minutes. The pleasant apple-like smell would rise with the steam, which was immediately comforting. You'd drink the tea, feeling the warmth of it settle into your stomach, feeling calmed by the ritual of it. You'd lie down, and within maybe 20 or 30 minutes, you'd notice a gentle drowsiness settling over you. It wouldn't be overwhelming, it wouldn't be dramatic. You'd just feel a bit more relaxed, a bit more ready to sleep. You'd drift off, and you'd sleep through the night. Now here's the thing. Was chamomile's effectiveness partly placebo? Almost certainly. The ritual of having a warm, pleasant drink before bed is inherently calming, regardless of what's in the drink. Your expectation that it will help you sleep might make you sleep better just through that expectation. But chamomile also has actual pharmacological effects, so the placebo and the actual chemistry are working together. You're getting helped by both the ritual and the chemistry, and that combination is powerful. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Chamomile appears consistently in medieval herbals as a safe, pleasant sleep aid. It's recommended across the entire social spectrum, from royal physicians recommending it to nobles, to simple herbals recommending it to anyone. There's a consensus around chamomile that's lacking for the more dramatic herbs. A quirky detail. Chamomile was sometimes combined with other pleasant herbs, like rose petals or mint, to create herbal tea blends. Medieval people understood at some level that combining herbs could create more pleasant experiences. This is arguably the origin of modern herbal tea blending, which is kind of cool when you think about it. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval sleep aids were effective, but chamomile is one herb that modern science backs up pretty clearly. It genuinely does help with sleep. It's safe. And medieval people were using it correctly. They didn't understand the pharmacology, but they understood the practice. What chamomile represents in the medieval nighttime pharmacy is something important. The recognition that not all medicine had to be dangerous, dramatic, or unpleasant. Sometimes the best medicine was something gentle and kind. Sometimes safety and effectiveness could coexist. This was probably a lesson medieval people needed to learn more often, given how many of their herbs could kill them. Chamomile was the proof that you didn't always have to risk your life to get help with your problems. So while Mandrake was getting all the attention with its mythology and danger, while Henbane was producing paranoid delusions, while Mugwort was promising lucid dreams and Valerian was stinking up the room, chamomile was quietly, reliably, pleasantly helping medieval people sleep. It's the herb you don't remember, the herb that's not exciting, the herb that just works. And in a time when so much of life was difficult and uncertain, maybe that reliability and safety were the most valuable gifts a plant could offer. Now we need to talk about poppies, because poppies are where medieval herbalism starts getting legally and morally complicated, and where we have to confront the question of whether medieval people were actually medicating themselves, or whether they were accidentally or deliberately getting high. Poppies, Papaver somniferum specifically, are pretty flowers that can be deep red, pink, white or purple depending on the variety. Medieval people grew them in gardens. They harvested them for seeds to use in cooking, and they also harvested the seed pods, because if you make a careful incision in the opium poppy seed pod, a milky latex oozes out. This latex, when dried, contains morphine, codeine and other alkaloid compounds. In other words, it's opium. Medieval people knew this, at least at some level. They knew that poppies had a powerful effect on pain, on sleep, on consciousness itself. The historical question that medieval scholars are still arguing about is this: to what extent were medieval physicians and herbalists using poppy preparations as actual medicine versus just getting people high and calling it treatment? The answer, frustratingly, is probably both, and it depends on the context. Poppy preparations definitely do have legitimate medicinal uses. If you're in severe pain and nothing else is available, opium will help. If you're desperately insomniac and everything else has failed, opium will put you to sleep. Medieval physicians knew this. They documented it. They recommended it for severe cases. But opium also gets you high. It creates euphoria. It creates dependence. And medieval physicians might not have fully understood these side effects, or they might have understood them and decided they were acceptable trade-offs. How medieval people used poppy is important to understand. Some would make a tea from the seed pods or the seeds themselves. This would give you some of the alkaloids, though not as much as opium proper would. Some would make an extract, boiling poppy pods to produce a concentrated liquid that could be drunk. Some would, and this is documented in medical texts, actually work with raw opium, which could be smoked or taken orally or applied as a poultice. These preparations range from relatively mild, some poppy seed tea would have minimal narcotic content, to dramatically strong, raw opium would produce immediate and intense effects. The documented uses of poppy in medieval medicine included pain relief, insomnia, anxiety and various illnesses. The idea was that poppy was a powerful medicine that should be reserved for serious cases. But the line between serious cases and any situation where someone wanted to feel better was probably pretty blurry in practice. If you were wealthy enough to afford poppy, you probably used it. If you were poor, you probably didn't have access to it, except maybe occasionally from an herbalist or physician. The experience of using poppy for sleep was probably this. If you were using a mild preparation like poppy seed tea, you'd feel mildly drowsy, maybe mildly euphoric, and you'd sleep. Nothing too dramatic. If you were using a stronger preparation, the effects would be more pronounced. You'd feel relaxed, your pain would decrease, whether or not you actually had pain, your worries would seem less pressing, and you'd feel a pleasant warmth spreading through your body. You'd feel good, genuinely good, in a way that most medieval medicine didn't make you feel. And then you'd sleep deeply and dreamlessly. You'd wake up feeling like you'd been transported somewhere pleasant. You'd probably want to do it again. This is where the complication comes in. Opium is addictive. Not everyone becomes addicted, but some people do, and there's no reliable way to predict who will. Medieval people might not have understood addiction in modern terms, but they probably noticed that some people wanted to use poppy again and again, that these people became irritable or anxious when they couldn't get poppy, that they'd spend excessive amounts of money or resources to obtain poppy. And yet there's very little historical evidence of widespread poppy addiction in medieval Europe. This might be because poppy was too expensive for most people, so even if they wanted to be addicted, they couldn't afford it. Or it might be because poppy preparations were less consistent and less potent than modern opium, so the addiction potential was lower. Or it might be that medieval people just didn't document addiction, or understood it differently. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Opium and opium-derived products were known and used in medieval medicine, particularly from the 12th century onward, as Islamic medical knowledge became more available to European physicians. Medieval medical texts describe opium's properties and recommend its use for specific conditions, with warnings about its dangers. A quirky detail: some medieval physicians recommended poppy preparations not just for sleep, but as a way to manage the trauma of certain medical procedures. If someone was going to have surgery or be cauterized, a common medieval treatment, the physician might give them poppy beforehand to make the experience less agonizing. So poppy was genuinely useful from a medical perspective, even if the mechanism of usefulness, getting someone high enough that they didn't care about pain, wasn't how medieval physicians would have described it. Historians still argue about the prevalence of poppy use in medieval society, the extent to which it was understood as addictive, and whether there's evidence of poppy abuse in the historical record. The consensus seems to be that poppy was known, respected and used, but that it wasn't as common as some other herbs, partly because of cost and partly because of its dangerous reputation. What poppy represents in the medieval nighttime medicine cabinet is a kind of knowledge that medieval people had but didn't fully embrace. They knew some substances could dramatically alter consciousness. They knew these substances could help with specific problems, but they also seemed to sense that there was something dangerous about them, something that made them different from other medicines. So they were careful with poppy, at least in theory. In practice, probably some people were less careful than others. The question of whether medieval people accidentally got addicted to poppy, or whether they deliberately got high and called it medicine, probably doesn't have a clean answer. It was probably both. Some people used poppy legitimately for pain or sleep, and developed a dependence they didn't quite understand. Some people probably used poppy because they liked how it felt and justified it as medicine. The distinction might have been blurry for medieval people in ways that it wasn't for modern people, because medieval people didn't have the concept of just wanting to feel good as separate from treating a medical condition. If poppy made you feel good, that was valuable, and it didn't necessarily matter whether you could point to a specific disease you were treating. In your medieval bed, if you were wealthy and desperate enough to use poppy, you'd experience something fundamentally different from the other herbs. You wouldn't just sleep. You wouldn't have interesting dreams or vivid experiences. You'd experience a profound sense of well-being, a dissolution of anxiety, a sense that everything was going to be okay even if objectively nothing was okay. You'd sleep deeply, dreamlessly, and wake up wanting to experience that feeling again. You'd become potentially dependent on a substance that cost more than you could afford, that was controlled by people with power over you, that was documented and discussed by medical authorities. You'd join the long, sad history of human beings using substances that make them feel better, even when those substances are bad for them. And medieval people, like all humans, were probably not immune to that pattern. Wormwood is one of those herbs that medieval people seem to tolerate out of pure stubbornness, in the same way they tolerated valerian despite its terrible smell. Wormwood was bitter, aggressively bitter, in a way that made you question whether you were treating an illness or punishing yourself. But medieval people used it anyway, because wormwood actually did something. It helped with digestion, it helped keep parasites away, and it had antiseptic properties that might actually prevent infection or help fight off minor illnesses. Wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, is a plant with greyish-green leaves and a distinctive, complex bitter taste. If you've ever heard of absinthe, the alcoholic drink that was popular in the 19th century and then banned for decades, that's made from wormwood, among other things. The taste is so distinctive and so aggressively bitter that people have strong reactions to it. Most people's first reaction to wormwood is, why would anyone consume this voluntarily? Medieval people's reaction was, yes, but does it work? And the answer was, sort of, yes. The compounds in wormwood that give it its medicinal properties include thujon, which we talked about with mugwort, various volatile oils, and alkaloids. These compounds do have digestive properties. They can help stimulate stomach acid and bile production, which helps with digestion. They also have mild antimicrobial properties, and they can help with certain parasites, which medieval people definitely had and definitely wanted to be rid of. So wormwood wasn't purely placebo. It actually did something, even if the something was relatively mild. How medieval people used wormwood varied. Some would make a tea, steeping dried wormwood in hot water, and then drinking this deeply unpleasant liquid. Some would make it into a tincture, soaking it in alcohol, which would at least mix the bitterness with something else. Some would burn it and inhale the smoke, though the smoke would be quite bitter and unpleasant to inhale. Some would add it to wine or other drinks to mask the taste slightly. It didn't really mask the taste, it just gave you something to blame the bad taste on. The common theme, however you used wormwood, it tasted or smelled bad, and you used it anyway. The specific use of wormwood at night seems to have been less common than its use during the day. Wormwood was more of a daytime medicine, something you'd take to improve digestion or kill parasites. But some medieval people did use wormwood at night, particularly if they had digestive issues that were keeping them awake, or if they were trying to address parasites and figured nighttime was a good time to do it. The idea was that wormwood would work overnight, attacking parasites while you slept. Here's something interesting about wormwood. The thujon content in wormwood is lower than in mugwort, so you wouldn't expect it to have psychoactive effects. But it does contain trace amounts of thujon, enough that some people might experience mild hallucinations or altered perception if they consumed a lot of it. Medieval herbalists were probably aware of this at some level. They knew wormwood was a powerful plant, they respected it, and they treated it carefully, despite the fact that the biggest danger from wormwood was probably just the terrible taste forcing you to abandon it before you could overdose. The experience of using wormwood at night was probably this. You'd prepare it, probably as a tea, steeping the dried herb in hot water. The smell as it's steeped would be distinctive, complex, bitter. You'd drink it, and immediately you'd regret it. The bitterness would coat your mouth and throat. Your stomach would notice the sudden presence of a powerful bitter substance, and would respond by increasing acid production and stimulating bile flow. You'd feel a complex set of digestive effects, some sensation of cleansing, maybe some nausea if you weren't used to it, definitely a sense that something was happening in your digestive system. Then you'd lie down, and you'd sleep, and hopefully your digestion would be better, and your parasites would be fewer when you woke up. The difficulty with wormwood is that it's hard to see how medieval people convinced themselves to use it regularly. It tastes terrible. It smells terrible when burned. The effects are not immediately satisfying the way valerian sedation or poppy's euphoria would be. You have to take it on faith that it's helping with your digestion and parasites, conditions you can't directly perceive being treated. This seems like the kind of medicine that medieval people would try once, hate it, and never use again. And yet it appears consistently in medieval herbals and medical texts, and there's evidence it was used regularly. This suggests that either medieval people were desperate enough to endure terrible tastes for the promise of better digestion, or they had been convinced deeply enough of wormwood's benefits that they were willing to tolerate it. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Wormwood appears in medical texts from ancient times through the medieval period and beyond. It's one of the oldest documented medicinal plants used by Greek, Roman, and medieval physicians. Its digestive and anti-parasitic properties were well understood by medieval standards. A quirky detail. Wormwood was sometimes used as a component in medicinal wines. Wine was mixed with wormwood extracts to create a medicine that was supposed to be more palatable. This creates a situation where medieval people were drinking a wine that was supposed to taste good, but tasted terrible because of the wormwood. And yet this was considered an improvement over just drinking wormwood tea. This says something about how bad wormwood tea must have tasted. Historians still argue about which medieval herbs had legitimate pharmacological effects versus which were primarily placebo or magical thinking. Wormwood is usually categorized as having legitimate pharmacological effects. The digestive stimulation and anti-parasitic properties are real. But how significant those effects were, and whether they were significant enough to justify the awful taste, is debatable. What wormwood represents in medieval nighttime herbalism is pragmatism, a plant that wasn't pleasant, wasn't exciting, had no glamorous mythology, but did something useful, and that usefulness was enough. Medieval people understood trade-offs. If you wanted parasites gone and digestion improved, you drank wormwood. You didn't enjoy it. You might resent it. But you did it, because the alternative was being sick and having more parasites. The fact that medieval people used such unpleasant herbs, not occasionally but regularly and consistently, tells us something important about medieval determination and medieval desperation. Your nighttime medicine didn't have to taste good. It didn't have to feel mystical. It just had to do something, and medieval people would endure the unpleasantness to get that benefit. Sage is the universal player in medieval nighttime herbalism, not as exciting as mandrake, not as unpleasant as wormwood, not as mysterious as mugwort, but present in nearly every medieval bedroom that had any herbs at all. If there's a plant that deserves to be called the default medieval sleep herb, it's sage. Sage, Salvia officinalis, is a woody herb with greyish-green leaves that are fuzzy to the touch. It has a strong, distinctive taste and smell. Herbaceous, slightly peppery, vaguely minty. The smell is pleasant in moderate amounts but can become overwhelming if you're surrounded by a lot of it. Medieval people grew it widely. It's relatively easy to cultivate. It doesn't require special conditions. Once you have a sage plant, it basically keeps, producing indefinitely if you manage it correctly. So sage was accessible. What made sage so universal was that it had multiple uses. You could use it for digestive issues. You could use it for sore throats. You could use it for religious ceremonies. Sage was used in blessing rituals in medieval Christianity, which gave it spiritual significance. And you could use it for sleep, either by burning it, making it into a tea, or simply hanging dried sage in your bedroom and letting it release its oils into the air. The compounds in sage that matter for sleep and general health include thujon. Yes, again, thujon shows up in multiple herbs, camphor, and various volatile oils. These compounds have mild sedative properties, antiseptic properties, and antibacterial properties. So sage actually does something. It can help with sleep. It can help prevent infection. It can help with respiratory issues if you're breathing in the smoke. It's not as powerful as poppy or henbane, but it's reliable and it's safe. Medieval people used sage at night in various ways. Some would burn it and let the smoke fill the bedroom. Sage smoke smells pleasant and distinctive, and medieval people seem to like it. Some would make a tea from dried sage leaves and drink it before bed. Some would stuff dried sage into pillows, the same way they'd use mugwort or valerian. Some would hang bundles of dried sage above the bed, both for the aroma and for the presumed medicinal effects of living in a room full of sage. The experience of using sage for sleep was probably this. You'd prepare it somehow, most likely burning it or making a tea. If burning it, the smoke would rise and fill your room with a pleasant, distinctive smell. The smoke would be mild compared to valerian or wormwood. You wouldn't be fighting against it. You'd breathe it in, and you'd feel a gentle calming effect. Your mind would slow down a bit. Your body would relax a bit. Nothing dramatic, just a slow shift toward a more sleep-ready state. You'd lie down, and sleep would come relatively easily. You'd sleep through the night. The next morning your bedroom would still smell like sage, which was considered a positive thing. It meant the room was clean, spiritually and physically. What's interesting about sage is that it seems to have been one of those herbs that was used by people across the social spectrum, because it was accessible, and because it was recognised as both practical and spiritually significant. A peasant might grow sage in a small garden because it was useful. A noble would have sage grown in their herb garden and would use it regularly. A monastery would definitely have sage, both because of its practical medicinal uses and because of its religious significance. The Catholic Church had a complicated relationship with herbalism. Some herbal practices were considered acceptable, others were considered suspicious and potentially associated with witchcraft. Sage seems to have been mostly acceptable, possibly because it had such strong Christian associations and such obvious practical uses. It wasn't surrounded by the kind of mystical, suspicious reputation that some other herbs had. It was just sage, useful, practical, reliable. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Sage appears in virtually every medieval herbal and medical text. Its uses are documented consistently across the entire medieval period and across different regions of Europe. There's an unusual unanimity about sage being good for health and sleep. A quirky detail: sage was sometimes used in medieval purification rituals, and the smoke of burned sage was thought to drive away evil spirits. This is similar to the smudging practices that would much later be associated with Native American traditions, though the medieval European sage burning was developed independently. It's a good example of how different cultures independently discovered that burning sage creates a pleasant smell and that the ritual of doing so has psychological benefits. Historians still argue about many aspects of medieval herbalism, but sage is one herb where there's unusual agreement. Medieval people used it. Modern scientific validation confirms it has mild sedative and antibacterial properties, and it's still in use today for similar purposes. It's one of the successful continuities in herbalism from medieval times to now. The universality of sage in medieval bedrooms tells us something important. Medieval people weren't always attracted to the most exotic, dangerous, or mysterious options. Sometimes they just wanted something that worked, that was safe, that was accessible, and that had a track record of being helpful. Sage offered all of this. It was the herb you knew you could rely on. It was the herb your grandmother probably used, and her grandmother before that. In a time of constant uncertainty and danger, that reliability and continuity were valuable. Sage burning became such a common practice that the smell of sage and smoke became associated, for medieval people, with healing and cleaning. When you smelled sage burning, you thought of health, cleanliness, spiritual purification. The herb had earned this association through centuries of use and positive outcomes. So when you lit sage in your bedroom before sleep, you weren't just releasing compounds that might help you sleep. You were participating in a ritual that connected you to generations of people who had done the same thing for the same reasons in hopes of the same outcomes. In your medieval bed, with sage smoke drifting around you, you'd feel connected to something bigger than just trying to sleep. You'd feel like you were doing what people did, what was known to work, what had worked for your ancestors and would probably work for you. And while that might sound like folklore, the psychological comfort of that continuity and confidence in a practice actually does help with sleep. So sage, in addition to its mild pharmacological properties, was also delivering a kind of confidence. This has worked before. It will work again. And confidence is actually a pretty effective sleep aid. Now we need to meet the people who were selling and promoting all these herbs, the medieval apothecaries and herbalists. Because the herbs didn't just appear in bedrooms by magic. Someone was growing them, harvesting them, drying them, and selling them to people who wanted them. And these people, the apothecaries, the herbalists, the wise women, the travelling merchants, occupied a specific and complicated position in medieval society. Medieval apothecaries were not quite doctors, not quite merchants, not quite magicians, but a bit of all three. Some were trained in medicine and had studied the learned texts. Some were just people who had learned herbalism through experience and family tradition. The distinction between a legitimate apothecary and a fraud was not always clear, even to medieval people. If you could provide herbs that seemed to work, you had credibility. If your remedies failed repeatedly, your credibility decreased. But there was a lot of room for people to market themselves as experts, even if their expertise was questionable. The life of an apothecary was relatively good from a medieval perspective. You had access to interesting materials, including things from distant parts of the world. You had some economic independence. You were running a business, making money from the demand for medicinal herbs. You had some social status. People came to you because they needed you, which created a kind of implicit authority. But you also had risk. If people used your remedies and got worse instead of better, they might blame you. If your remedies contained anything that seemed suspicious or mystical, you might be accused of witchcraft or sorcery. You were operating in an area where the line between legitimate medicine and forbidden magic was very blurry. The reputation of apothecaries was mixed. Some were genuinely respected, particularly if they had studied medicine and had credentials from a university or from the church. Some were seen as suspicious, people who made money from selling dubious substances to desperate people. Medieval literature sometimes portrays apothecaries as villains, as people willing to sell you poison if you had the money to pay for it. Shakespeare's apothecary in Romeo and Juliet is poor and willing to sell Romeo a poison because he needs the money. This might be a bit of literary exaggeration, but it reflects a real aspect of apothecaries' reputation. They were people who could provide dangerous substances if you wanted them and could pay for them. How apothecaries obtained herbs varied. Some grew herbs themselves, maintaining gardens of medicinal plants. Some purchased herbs from farmers or other gatherers. Some obtained them through trade networks that extended across Europe and into the Islamic world, bringing exotic herbs from distant places. A medieval apothecary might have access to herbs from Spain, from the Mediterranean, from the Near East, depending on trade routes and connections. These exotic herbs were expensive and were marketed as being more potent than common herbs. There was probably truth to this sometimes, and exaggeration other times. The apothecary's shop itself was an important location. It was where people came when they were desperate, when they were sick, when they couldn't sleep and had tried everything else. It was a place of hope, and also a place of uncertainty. You'd walk in and see jars and bundles and mysterious dried things hanging from the ceiling. You wouldn't necessarily understand what all of it was. The apothecary would explain, or would convince you that they understood, whether or not they actually did. You'd negotiate a price. You'd leave with your herbs and the hope that they would help. Some apothecaries were women, and these female apothecaries often had particularly interesting positions in medieval society. They had knowledge, which gave them power. They had economic independence, which was rare for medieval women. But they also faced suspicion more readily than male apothecaries did. If your remedies failed, people were more likely to wonder if you were actually a witch than if a male apothecary's remedies failed. The line between wise woman and witch was terrifyingly thin in medieval Europe. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval apothecaries were gradually professionalized over the medieval period. By the later medieval period, apothecaries had guilds, had training standards, and had some degree of regulation. But in the earlier medieval period, the profession was much less regulated, and anyone with access to herbs and some ability to convince people of their efficacy could set themselves up as an apothecary. A quirky detail. Some medieval apothecaries would actually test their remedies on animals before selling them to humans, which shows that they had at least some understanding that the dose or preparation might be lethal. There are records of apothecaries deliberately limiting the concentration of certain herbs in their products to make them safer, which is a kind of proto-quality control. These apothecaries understood that their reputation depended on their remedies actually helping people, not poisoning them, so they had incentive to be careful. Historians still argue about the legitimacy of medieval apothecaries' medical knowledge. Some argue that apothecaries had accumulated real, useful knowledge through experience, and that their remedies often worked, at least somewhat. Others argue that apothecaries were primarily selling placebo and hope to desperate people. The truth is probably contextual. Some apothecaries were knowledgeable and careful, others were charlatans, and most were probably somewhere in between, doing their best with incomplete knowledge and questionable resources. The apothecary's role in medieval nighttime culture was specific. They were the people who could provide the herbs that you couldn't grow yourself, or that you didn't know how to prepare. If you wanted mandrake, you went to an apothecary. If you wanted a specific preparation of henbane that was supposedly less dangerous than others, you went to an apothecary. If you wanted someone to tell you what to use and how to use it, you went to an apothecary. They were the intermediaries between the herbs themselves and the desperate people who wanted to use them. The economics of the apothecary business are worth thinking about. Apothecaries charged money for herbs, which meant that wealthy people had better access to a wider variety of herbs than poor people. A rich person could buy mandrake, could buy exotic herbs from the Far East, could have a personal relationship with an apothecary who would prepare custom remedies. A poor person might have access to common herbs like sage and chamomile, might occasionally visit an apothecary, might spend more on herbs than they could really afford. This meant that medieval sleep aid access was determined partly by wealth and partly by knowledge. If you were wealthy and connected to a good apothecary, you had better options. If you were poor, you had fewer options. In your medieval town, the apothecary's shop would be a known location. You might have visited it before, or you might have heard stories about it. You might be nervous going in, nervous about the cost, nervous about whether the remedy would actually work, nervous about whether the apothecary was legitimate or a charlatan. You'd walk in, describe your sleep problems, and wait to see what the apothecary would recommend. They'd probably know you were desperate because most people who came to apothecaries were desperate. They'd probably recommend something expensive if you looked like you could afford it, and something cheaper if you looked like you couldn't. They'd probably be convincing because if they weren't convincing you wouldn't buy anything, and then you'd take your herbs home and hope they worked. Now we need to talk about the women who were involved in herbalism, because herbalism was in many ways a female-dominated knowledge practice in medieval Europe. This was partly because women had control of the household medicine cabinet, partly because women passed herbal knowledge down through female relatives, and partly because women's position on the margins of society actually allowed them more freedom in some areas, particularly in areas that were considered suspect or marginal themselves. The medieval herbalist woman occupied an interesting position. She might be a healer, using her knowledge to treat illness in her family and community. She might be a midwife, using herbs to help women through pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery. She might be a wise woman or cunning woman, using her knowledge for a broader range of purposes, some of which might be considered magical or spiritual. Or she might be some combination of all of these. The distinctions between these roles were not always clear, and a single woman might be known in her community as all three of these things simultaneously. Women's herbal knowledge was often transmitted through families, particularly through the female line. A mother would teach her daughters which herbs to grow, how to harvest them, how to prepare them. A grandmother would pass knowledge down. An older woman in the community might teach younger women. This created a kind of continuous knowledge tradition that existed outside of formal education and institutional structures. Men could access herbal knowledge through university training or through working with established apothecaries, but women accessed it through family and community networks, which was actually very effective because it meant the knowledge was embedded in practical experience and was tested by generations of actual use. The herbs that women particularly controlled were often the ones related to women's health. Herbs for menstruation, herbs for pregnancy, herbs for childbirth, herbs for recovery after birth. These were areas where women had experience that men didn't have, where women's knowledge was necessary because medieval physicians were often trained by other men and often did not attend births or deal with menstrual issues. So women developed sophisticated knowledge about these areas and controlled the herbal remedies related to them. This gave women a specific kind of power and authority. For nighttime herbalism specifically, women seem to have been particularly involved in the growing and preparation of herbs that were used for sleep and dreams. Mugwort, with its associations with dreams and women's spirituality, seems to have been more commonly grown and used by women. Valerian, with its unpleasant smell but proven effectiveness, seems to have been something that women would prepare because they had the knowledge and the willingness to work with difficult plants. Chamomile, the safe and gentle herb, was probably widely grown and used by women in medieval households. The wise woman or cunning woman of a medieval community was often specifically someone with knowledge of herbs and their properties. She might be consulted when someone couldn't sleep, and she might provide herbal remedies, often along with rituals or blessings that were thought to enhance the herb's effectiveness. The combination of herbal knowledge and spiritual or magical knowledge gave these women authority and made them sought after, but it also made them dangerous in the eyes of the church and the authorities. If your herbal remedies worked, great. If they didn't work, you might be accused of witchcraft. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Women herbalists and healers appear frequently in medieval records: wills, legal documents, medical texts, literature. They are documented as having controlled herbal knowledge, and as having provided herbal remedies to their communities. This was a recognised role, even if it was sometimes precarious. A quirky detail: some medieval herbals appear to have been written by or for women, or at least reflect women's herbal knowledge. The Trotula texts, which deal with women's health, include herbal remedies for sleep, and include perspectives that seem to come from women's experience. These texts are evidence that women's herbal knowledge was documented and valued, at least in some contexts. Historians still argue about the extent to which women's herbalism was empowering versus constraining. Some argue that herbal knowledge gave women real power and authority in their communities. Others argue that this power was always precarious, always subject to being redefined as witchcraft, always contingent on the goodwill of men who could accuse women of sorcery. The truth is probably that it was both. Herbalism gave women some power, but it also made them more vulnerable in specific ways. The relationship between women's herbalism and witchcraft accusations is important to understand. Women who knew a lot about herbs, who spent time in nature gathering plants, who were consulted for magical or spiritual remedies, who had the authority to tell people to do things and people listened. These women looked suspicious to authorities who were trying to root out witchcraft. The fact that her remedies worked probably didn't help. If her herbs actually did help with sleep or did help with pain, that was evidence of power. And power in a woman was suspicious. So the same knowledge that gave a woman authority also put her at risk. In your medieval village, the wise woman who provided herbs would be someone you'd know. You might respect her, might rely on her, might trust her knowledge more than you'd trust the official physician from the nearby town. You might visit her when you couldn't sleep, and she'd give you herbs from her garden or from her stores. She'd probably charge you something, not as much as the official apothecary would, but something. And she'd probably give you instructions on how to use the herbs, and she'd probably tell you some kind of blessing or ritual that you should do while using them. Whether the blessing and ritual had any actual effect or whether they were just making you feel more confident in the remedy is debatable, but either way they probably helped you sleep better. And then you'd use the herbs, and hopefully you'd sleep, and you'd be grateful, and you'd remember this woman as helpful and wise. That was often enough. That was often what passed for medicine in medieval times. Monks deserve their own section, because monastic life was fundamentally different from secular life, and the monks' approach to nighttime herbalism reflected that. Monasteries were places of intentional, organised community. They had gardens that were specifically designed and maintained. They had time for the kind of detailed record-keeping that created our best surviving sources about medieval herb use. And they had the combination of spiritual authority and practical knowledge that put monks in a unique position regarding herbs. Medieval monks grew herbs in monastic gardens. These gardens served multiple purposes, providing food, providing medicine, providing materials for dyes and other craft work, and providing herbs for spiritual practices. The monastic garden was organised and maintained carefully. Different herbs had their own spaces. The harvest and storage were documented. The uses were tracked. From an organisational perspective, monastic herb cultivation was probably the most sophisticated herbal practice in medieval Europe. The monks used herbs for sleep and other purposes, and they documented this use. Monastic schedules were intense and involved regular sleeping patterns that would be considered insane by modern standards. Monks would go to bed, sleep a few hours, be awakened for nighttime prayers, the office of matins, pray for sometimes hours, go back to bed, sleep a bit more, then be awakened again before dawn for more prayers. This fragmented sleep schedule was standard monastic practice, and it would drive most modern people insane. Medieval monks, if they were struggling with this exhausting schedule, might turn to herbal solutions to help them sleep more deeply during the time they had available, or to make the nighttime prayers feel less exhausting. What herbs would monks have used? They would have had access to all the common herbs we've discussed: sage, chamomile, mugwort, valerian. They also had access to some more exotic herbs that their monasteries had cultivated. Some monasteries grew poppies, some grew other plants specifically for medicinal purposes. The monks' medical knowledge came from texts, from inherited manuscripts that contained descriptions of herbs and their properties. They would have had access to translations of Greek, Roman and Islamic medical texts, so their herb use would have been informed by learned tradition as well as practical experience. The monastic attitude toward herbs was interesting because it combined the practical with the spiritual. A monk might use an herb because it had documented medicinal properties in a text they'd read, and simultaneously because the herb itself was thought to have spiritual significance. Sage, as mentioned, was used in blessing rituals. Other herbs might be used because they were mentioned in the Bible, or in the lives of saints. So the monks' herbalism was not just practical medicine, it was also spiritual practice. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Monastic herbals and medical texts document the cultivation and use of numerous herbs with detailed descriptions of their properties and proper preparation. Some of these texts appear to be based on practical experience with the herbs, suggesting that monks were testing and refining herbal knowledge. A quirky detail. Some monks seem to have been genuinely interested in the properties of herbs and conducted something like experiments, growing different varieties and noting differences in their effects. These weren't scientific experiments in the modern sense, but they were more systematic than casual observation. Some of this experimental attitude seems to have been driven by the monks' larger project of understanding God's creation. If God created these plants with properties, understanding those properties was a way of understanding God's design. Historians still argue about the extent to which monastic herbalism was scientifically grounded versus superstitious, but what's clear is that monks had the luxury of time and organisation that allowed them to study herbs systematically. They kept records, they maintained gardens, they passed knowledge down. In a medieval world where most knowledge was lost and forgotten, monastic herbalism provided continuity. The monks' use of herbs at night would have been part of their broader spiritual discipline. If they needed help sleeping, they might use herbs, but they would probably frame this as accepting God's gifts rather than just solving a practical problem. They might pray while preparing the herbs. They might use the herbs while maintaining awareness that God was the ultimate healer. So the combination of prayer and herb would feel coherent to them. Both were ways of addressing the need for rest and endurance. In a monastic bedroom, the nighttime herb use would look different from secular use. There would be more documentation, more organisation, more connection to spiritual practice. A monk using herbs for sleep would be doing so in a structured way, probably following instructions that had been passed down and documented. The experience would be embedded in the larger context of monastic spiritual practice. What monastic herbalism tells us is that medieval people could be sophisticated in their approach to herbs when they had the time, organisation and resources to be. Monks couldn't solve all the fundamental problems with their herbs. They couldn't make their impossibly fragmented sleep schedule actually adequate, and no amount of herb would change that. But they could work with what they had. They could use their knowledge systematically. They could document what they learned, and in doing so they preserved knowledge about herbs that might otherwise have been lost. Royal bedchambers were different from everyone else's bedrooms, and this difference extended to the herbs being burned in them. When you have money and power, you have access to the rarest, most potent, most expensive herbs. A king or queen's bedroom smoke was not the same as a peasant's bedroom smoke. Royalty and nobility had the resources to obtain exotic herbs from distant places. Trade networks that brought spices from the east brought rare medicinal plants as well. A noble household might have access to mandrake, expensive, dangerous, but available if you had the connections and the money. They would have access to the finest quality of common herbs, the best chamomile, the best sage, cultivated specifically for the royal household. They might have access to herbs that were not generally available to common people. The preparation of herbs in a royal bedroom would have been more elaborate than in a peasant's hovel. A noble household would have servants and specialists whose job included preparing medicines and arranging herbal remedies. An apothecary or herbalist might be employed specifically by the noble household. The herbs would be carefully selected, carefully prepared, and carefully applied. The experience would be more refined, more luxurious. The status element of rare herbs is worth thinking about. If everyone used sage and chamomile for sleep, sage and chamomile became common, ordinary, not particularly impressive. But if you could use mandrake, if you could use rare herbs from distant places, if you could have herbal remedies prepared specifically for you by specialists, that was impressive. That was a display of wealth and power. So nobility probably had access to herbs not just because they were better for sleep, but because using them was a way of demonstrating status. What herbs might a noble have preferred? Mandrake would have been a possibility, particularly for someone facing genuine sleep deprivation and willing to take the risks. Poppies and poppy-derived preparations would have been available to wealthy people. Exotic herbs, ones with foreign origins and high prices, would have been available. Some combination of rare and common herbs carefully prepared by skilled practitioners. The bedroom environment itself would have been different. Instead of a small, drafty room filled with straw, a noble would have had a more elaborate bed, better insulation, possibly a brazier for heat. The herbs would have been burned in more sophisticated ways, perhaps in special vessels designed for the purpose, perhaps in ways that allowed for better control of the smoke. The overall experience would have been more comfortable and more controlled. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval nobles are documented as having employed physicians and herbalists specifically to manage their health. These practitioners would have had access to rare and expensive herbs and would have prepared them carefully for the nobles' use. Medical texts from the period include recommendations for herbs specifically for use by nobles. A quirky detail. Some medieval texts describe elaborate herbal preparations that seem designed specifically for wealthy people, with multiple rare ingredients combined in specific ways. These were not just for sleep, they were for various conditions, but they give us a sense of how much more elaborate herbal medicine could be when you had resources. Historians still argue about whether the superiority of noble herbal remedies was real or just a matter of access and perception. Certainly noble people had access to better quality herbs. Certainly they had better preparation, and potentially more effective preparations. But whether the herbs themselves were actually more effective, or whether the effectiveness came from better preparation, and the psychological confidence that comes with using expensive, rare substances, that's debatable. What's clear is that hierarchy extended even into herbalism. If you were poor, you made do with what you could grow or afford. If you were wealthy, you had options, and this meant that sleep quality, or at least access to help achieving sleep quality, was determined partly by wealth. A poor person struggling with insomnia had access to sage and chamomile. A noble struggling with insomnia might have access to the best of everything, including mandrake and rare exotic herbs. That's not fair, but that's how it was. Now let's contrast the royal bedroom with the peasant's experience, because that contrast is essential to understanding medieval herbalism in full context. If a noble's bedroom was filled with carefully selected expensive herbs prepared by specialists, a peasant's bedroom was a very different situation. A peasant's hovel, if you recall from section 2, was not a pleasant place. It was small, cold, damp, full of smells, and shared with family members and possibly animals. If a peasant was using herbs for sleep, they would be using what they could grow themselves or what they could afford to buy. The most likely options would be sage if they grew it, chamomile if they had access to it, mugwort, which grew wild and could be foraged, maybe valerian if they knew how to harvest it and prepare it, but valerian was less common among peasants because it requires specific knowledge and effort. A peasant using sage for sleep would probably just burn dried sage in the room or make a simple tea. No elaborate preparation, no specialist involved. Just dry the sage from their garden, light it or steep it, and hope it helps. The experience would be simple, basic, effective, or not, depending on the herb and the peasant's luck. The economics of peasant herbalism are worth considering. A peasant might not have money to buy herbs, so they would have to grow them themselves. This required land to grow herbs in, time to maintain the plants, knowledge of how to grow them, and the ability to harvest and dry them. Not all peasants had all of these. A landless peasant, someone who worked land owned by someone else, might not have space for a personal herb garden. A peasant working every hour of daylight to survive might not have time to maintain herbs. A peasant without herbal knowledge from family or community might not know how to grow or prepare herbs. So while herbs were theoretically available to peasants, they were not universally available. This meant that sleep deprivation was probably worse among poor peasants than among people with more resources. You couldn't afford to buy herbs from an apothecary. You couldn't grow them. You had no access to them. You had to suffer through the insomnia, or you had to find alternative solutions, praying, enduring, working yourself so hard that you collapsed into sleep despite being in a hovel full of parasites and bad smells. The smell of a peasant's hovel at night was probably not improved by herb smoke. A peasant would be more likely to not have herbs at all than to have them. If they did have herbs, burning them would be adding one more smell to the mix. Whether this was an improvement is debatable. At least the herb smell was intentional, was an attempt to do something about your situation. That might count for something. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Peasants' herbalism is less well documented than that of nobles or educated physicians, partly because peasants left fewer records. But what records we have suggest that peasants did use herbs when they could access them, and that they used common herbs like sage, chamomile and mugwort. A quirky detail: some of the most powerful herbal knowledge might have actually come from peasants, because peasants had to solve practical problems with limited resources and had to know how to use herbs effectively or face consequences. A peasant who knew how to use valerian despite its terrible smell had probably discovered through experience that it worked, not because they'd read it in a text, but because they'd tried it. Historians still argue about peasant herbalism partly because it's hard to document. Peasants didn't leave written records of their practices, but the fact that herbal knowledge was passed down through families, and that this transmission happened across all social classes, suggests that peasants were involved in and contributing to herbal knowledge in ways that formal sources don't capture. What's clear is that access to herbal remedies for sleep was stratified by wealth and knowledge. A peasant had fewer options than a noble. A peasant had to do more of the work themselves. A peasant had less help from specialists. And a peasant probably dealt with worse sleep deprivation as a result, because while they might have access to the same basic herbs as anyone else, they had fewer resources to maximize the effectiveness of those herbs. In your peasant's hovel at night, you would not have elaborate herbal preparations. You would have whatever you could manage, maybe some sage you'd grown yourself, maybe some mugwort you'd foraged, maybe nothing at all. The smoke, if you created any, would mix with all the other smells of the hovel. The hope would be there that the herb would help. Whether it actually did would probably depend partly on your desperation and your belief in it, and partly on whether the herb actually worked. It was probably a mixed result more often than not. Now we need to talk about the blurry boundary between incense and medicine, between spiritual burning and medicinal inhalation, because this distinction that feels obvious to us was not at all obvious to medieval people. In modern thinking, incense is something you burn for religious purposes or for smell, while medicine is something you ingest or apply to heal a condition. Medieval people didn't have this clean distinction. In medieval Christianity, burning incense was part of worship. Incense, often made from resins like frankincense and myrrh, which came from distant places and were expensive, was burned in churches as part of ritual. The smoke rising was understood as prayers rising to heaven. The smell was understood as spiritually purifying. This was religious practice, not medical practice. But many of the substances used in religious incense had medicinal properties. Frankincense has anti-inflammatory properties. Myrrh has antimicrobial properties. So if you were burning these substances in a church, you were breathing in compounds that would have effects on your body and mind, whether or not you understood them as medicinal. And if you were burning these substances in your bedroom at night, were you doing so for religious purposes or medicinal purposes or both? This ambiguity extended to many herbs. Sage, as mentioned, was used in religious blessing rituals, but sage also had medicinal properties and was used as medicine. So was burning sage in your bedroom an act of spiritual protection, or an act of medicine, or was the distinction irrelevant? Medieval people probably didn't see it as a distinction that mattered. If sage helped protect you spiritually and also helped you sleep, then it served both purposes simultaneously. Why would you separate the two? This blending of spiritual and medicinal purposes meant that medieval herbalism was embedded in a spiritual framework. When you used an herb, you were not just ingesting or inhaling a chemical compound. You were participating in a spiritual act. You were receiving a gift from nature that God had created. You were potentially opening yourself to spiritual as well as physical healing. The herb was medicine, and it was spiritual substance simultaneously, and the medieval mind didn't see a contradiction. This is actually quite different from modern thinking, where we separate the physical and the spiritual, where we assume that medicine works through chemistry and spirituality is separate from chemistry. Medieval people didn't have this framework. They thought about the world in terms of essences, spirits, powers, divine design. An herb didn't just have chemical compounds, it had an essence, a virtue, a spiritual property. Using the herb meant encountering that property, engaging with it. This framing probably affected the efficacy of medieval herbalism. If you believed that an herb had spiritual properties, if you believed you were participating in something sacred when you used it, if you set an intention and performed a ritual, then the psychological power of that belief and that ritual would enhance the herb's effects. Your expectation would make you more likely to notice positive effects and less likely to notice negative ones. Your belief would make you more receptive to the herb's effects. The placebo effect would be more powerful because it was embedded in a spiritual framework. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval herbals often described the properties of herbs in terms that seem to blend the physical, spiritual and magical. An herb might be described as having power or virtue, terms that don't clearly distinguish between pharmacological effect and spiritual property. A quirky detail. Some medieval herbals describe the harvesting of herbs as requiring specific rituals or prayers. The idea was that harvesting an herb was not just a physical act, but a spiritual act, and the way you did it affected the herb's properties. This is explicitly documented in some texts. Instructions for harvesting herbs that include prayers or specific times, like a certain phase of the moon, meant to maximize the herb's spiritual and medicinal properties. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval people's beliefs in spiritual properties of herbs were actually affecting their experience of the herbs, or whether the spiritual belief was purely psychological and not affecting anything real. But what's clear is that medieval people experienced the herbs through a framework that included spiritual dimensions, and this framework probably made the herbs more effective because the framework itself was doing psychological work. What's important to understand is that for medieval people, burning incense and burning medicinal herbs were not fundamentally different activities. You were burning something, you were inhaling the smoke, and the smoke was doing something, physically and spiritually. Whether you called it incense or medicine was partly a matter of context and intent. If you were burning it in a church, it was incense. If you were burning it in your bedroom for sleep, it was medicine. But the substance and the practice were often the same. Now we have to confront something darker, the connection between herb use, witchcraft accusations, and fear. Because while we've been talking about herbalism as a practical medical practice, we also need to acknowledge that in medieval Europe, particularly from around the 14th century onward, herbalism became increasingly associated with witchcraft, and women herbalists increasingly found themselves accused of supernatural crimes. The witch hunts of the medieval and early modern periods are often presented as hysteria or superstition, and there's some truth to that. But they were also partially an attack on herbalism, because if you were known to use herbs extensively, if you burned herbs and incense, if you had knowledge of plants and their properties, if you prepared medicines, if people consulted you for remedies, you looked like a potential witch. You looked like someone who had knowledge of supernatural powers hidden in plants. The fear was roughly like this. If herbs could affect the mind, if they could cause hallucinations, if they could make you see things that weren't there, then they had a kind of supernatural quality. And if a woman had extensive knowledge of herbs, if she knew which plants could make people hallucinate or see things, then she potentially had access to supernatural knowledge and supernatural power. She could, potentially, harm people using herbs. She could curse someone by giving them poisoned herbs. She could use her knowledge for malevolent purposes. This fear was not entirely unfounded, in the sense that herbs like henbane and mandrake really could harm people. If someone wanted to poison someone else, they could, using herbs. If someone wanted to drug someone without their knowledge, they could do that too. So the fear that knowledgeable herbalists could use their knowledge for harm was based on genuine dangers. The problem was that people jumped from "this herb knowledge could be used for harm" to "this person who has herb knowledge is definitely using it for harm," and women herbalists found themselves accused of witchcraft, often on the basis of being successful healers. The logic of witchcraft accusations against herbalists went something like this. If your herb remedy actually cured someone's illness, that was suspicious. How could an herb, which should just be a plant, possibly cure a serious illness? The only explanation was that you were using supernatural powers. You were a witch. Or, conversely, if your herb remedy failed to cure someone, that was also suspicious. How could someone with knowledge of herbs fail to cure an illness? The only explanation was that you were deliberately using your powers to harm people. You were a witch. In other words, herbalists, particularly women herbalists, were in a no-win situation. Success was evidence of witchcraft. Failure was evidence of witchcraft. You were caught either way. Some of the most famous witch trials involved herbalists, healers, wise women, midwives, people who had herbal knowledge and who used it to help their communities, found themselves accused of witchcraft, tried and executed. The evidence against them often included things like they had dried herbs hanging in their homes, they muttered while preparing remedies, they charged money for their services, they had knowledge that seemed mysterious to ordinary people. These are not actually evidence of witchcraft, but they were treated as evidence in court. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In the period from roughly 1400 to 1650, tens of thousands of people were accused of witchcraft and executed primarily in Europe. A significant proportion of these were people known for herbal healing or medicine. The persecution of herbalists was systematic in some regions. A quirky detail. In some cases, herbalists were accused of witchcraft because their remedies actually worked, and people couldn't understand how an herb alone could be effective. The success of the remedy was treated as evidence of supernatural involvement. It's a tragic irony. The herbalists who were most effective, who understood herbs best and could prepare them most skillfully, were often the most vulnerable to witchcraft accusations. Historians still argue about the causes of the witch hunts and the role of herbalism in them. Some argue that the hunting down of herbalists was a deliberate effort to eliminate traditional medicine and consolidate medical authority in the hands of educated, male, physicians and the church. Others argue that it was more about misunderstanding and fear than deliberate suppression. Probably both factors were involved. What this means is that in medieval nighttime herbalism, there was an undercurrent of danger that we haven't fully addressed. Using certain herbs, particularly if you had distinctive knowledge about them, particularly if you were a woman, put you at risk. Your neighbours might notice that you were burning strange herbs. They might suspect you of witchcraft. They might report you to authorities. You could be accused, tried and executed based on the fact that you were good at healing. This context gives us a different way of understanding medieval herb use. It wasn't just a practical matter of solving sleep problems. It was also an act that carried social risk, particularly for women. A wise woman using mandrake to help someone sleep was not just providing medicine. She was displaying knowledge that could be misinterpreted as supernatural. She was putting herself in danger. In your medieval village, if you were a woman known for herb use, you would be aware of this risk. You would probably be careful about what you said about your herbs, about how you prepared them, about how you explained their effects. You couldn't be too openly magical or supernatural about it. That invited accusations. But you also couldn't deny that your remedies worked, because your reputation and livelihood depended on their effectiveness. You were walking a very fine line between being respected as a healer and being feared as a witch. We need to acknowledge the Islamic influence on medieval European herbalism, because medieval Europe didn't develop its herb knowledge in isolation. It inherited knowledge and practices from Islamic medical tradition, and this connection was profound and sometimes invisible. From roughly the 8th century onward, the Islamic Golden Age was producing sophisticated medical texts, including detailed herbals. Physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina wrote comprehensive medical encyclopedias that included descriptions of herbs, their properties, their uses. These texts were more systematically organised and more detailed than most European medical knowledge of the time, and over the medieval period these texts gradually became available to European scholars, either through direct translation from Arabic or through indirect transmission through trade and cultural contact. This transmission happened primarily through a few routes. Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, was in direct contact with Christian Europe and was a place where medical knowledge was translated and shared. The Mediterranean trade networks brought Islamic texts to Europe and brought European scholars to Islamic centres of learning. The Crusades, paradoxically, also brought medical knowledge. Crusaders would encounter Islamic medical practices and would bring information back home. Gradually, Islamic medical knowledge integrated into European medical practice. What this meant for herbalism was that European herbalists and physicians inherited knowledge about plants that Islamic herbalists had developed. Some of the herbs we've been discussing, mandrake, henbane, poppy, were documented and discussed in Islamic medical texts. The dosages, the warnings, the documented effects, all of this had been worked out by Islamic physicians before it reached European herbalists. So when a medieval European used mandrake, they might be using knowledge that ultimately came from Islamic medical tradition, even if the connection wasn't always obvious. The most explicit evidence of this is in medieval European medical texts that are clearly based on or influenced by Islamic texts. The translations of Galen and other Greek physicians, which form the basis of medieval European medicine, often came through Islamic intermediaries who had preserved and commented on Greek texts during a period when they were being forgotten in Europe. So Islamic scholarship literally preserved classical European knowledge and then transmitted it back to Europe. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Many medieval European medical texts are explicitly based on or translated from Islamic texts. This is documented and acknowledged in the texts themselves and in the historical record. The transmission of medical knowledge from Islamic to European sources was systematic and substantial. A quirky detail: some of the exotic herbs that became available to wealthy Europeans in the medieval period came through Islamic trade networks. Nutmeg, mace, clove, and other spices that we think of as global commodities were accessed by medieval Europe primarily through Islamic-controlled trade routes. So using these exotic spices and herbs was, in a sense, participating in a global network that centered on Islamic trade and knowledge. Historians still argue about the extent of Islamic influence on European medicine, with some emphasizing it heavily, and others suggesting that European medicine developed more independently than is sometimes suggested. But what's clear is that some knowledge was transmitted and some herbs and practices were influenced by Islamic sources. What this context tells us is that medieval European herbalism was not isolated European folklore. It was part of a larger medieval world that included Islamic scholarship, Islamic trade, and the gradual transmission of knowledge across religious and political boundaries. A medieval European herbalist might not have known the Islamic origins of their knowledge, but they were in fact participating in a tradition that was partly Islamic in its roots. In the context of nighttime herbalism, this means that some of the herbs medieval Europeans were burning for sleep might be herbs that Islamic physicians had documented centuries earlier. The knowledge about mandrake's hallucinogenic properties, the knowledge about opium's pain-relieving effects, the knowledge about valerian's sedative properties, some of this had been worked out in Islamic medical tradition before being transmitted to Europe. So medieval Europeans were, in a sense, using knowledge that had been tested and refined over centuries in a different cultural and religious context. This also raises interesting questions about knowledge transmission. How much of Islamic herbalism was accurately transmitted, and how much was lost or distorted in translation? How much of what Europeans thought they knew about Islamic medicine was actually based on the texts, versus how much was based on misunderstandings or selective transmission? These are questions that historians are still working through. What's important is that medieval herbalism was not isolated folklore. not developed purely within the European tradition, but rather a hybrid practice influenced by knowledge from other parts of the world. This adds depth to our understanding of medieval herb use. These weren't just things that medieval people stumbled onto on their own. These were things they learned, partially, from sophisticated medical traditions in other parts of the medieval world. The Church's stance on herbs was complicated, and we need to understand this complication because it affected what herbs people could use and how openly they could use them. On the one hand, the Church was deeply suspicious of anything that looked magical or supernatural, including herb use that seemed too effective or too mysterious. On the other hand, the Church was involved in medicine, and many of the best documented medieval physicians and herbalists were clergy, particularly monks. So the Church was simultaneously suspicious of herbs and dependent on them. This contradiction created a landscape where herb use was always somewhat precarious. You could use certain herbs openly and without suspicion. Sage, because it was used in blessing rituals, was safe. Chamomile, because it was gentle and well documented, was safe. But herbs that seemed to have more dramatic effects, herbs that required mysterious preparation, herbs that were associated with hallucinations or supernatural experiences, these were more suspect. The issue with magical plants like mandrake was that the prohibition against magic was a real thing in medieval Christianity. Magic was considered demonic, was associated with witchcraft and devil worship, was explicitly condemned by the Church. So if an herb was used in a way that was explicitly magical, if rituals were performed, if spells were spoken, if the herb was treated as a magical object rather than just a medicinal plant, the Church might object. But if an herb was used simply as medicine, without the magical framework, the Church might be okay with it. This meant that the same herb could be acceptable or unacceptable, depending on how you used it and how you framed it. Some Church authorities seem to have distinguished between herbs that were used as medicine, acceptable, and herbs that were used magically, unacceptable. So you could use mandrake as a medicine, as long as you didn't do the screaming root ritual or pretend it had magical properties. You could use poppy for pain, as long as you weren't using it to induce visions or hallucinations. The chemistry of the herb didn't change, but the intent and the framing did, and intent and framing mattered to the Church. This distinction probably affected how medieval people used herbs in practice. You would use them as medicines, emphasizing the practical, health-related benefits. You would not emphasize any mystical or magical properties. You might privately believe in spiritual dimensions of herb use, but you would probably not discuss this openly with the Church authorities. This created a kind of public/private divide, where the official stance, herbs are medicine not magic, was different from the lived experience. Herbs had spiritual properties, and the spiritual dimensions mattered. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval Church authorities issued pronouncements about herbalism, sometimes approving it as medicine, and sometimes condemning it as magic or witchcraft. These pronouncements were not always consistent, and different regions had different policies. But the general principle was that herb use needed to be framed as medical practice, not magical practice. A quirky detail: some monastic herbals were deliberately framed as medical texts, following the format of classical medical authorities, even though the contents might include practices that had magical elements. The framing was deliberate. Making the text look like medicine rather than magic meant it was more likely to be accepted by Church authorities. Historians still argue about the degree to which Church disapproval actually affected herb use in practice. Probably it affected what people would openly admit to doing and how they would frame their practices, but people probably continued using herbs magically even if the official stance was disapproving. The Church's authority was real, but people could often get around it by being discreet about their magical use. The upshot of Church involvement in herbalism was that medieval herb use was always somewhat constrained by religious authority. You could use herbs, but you had to be careful. You had to frame them as medicine, not magic. You had to be careful not to seem like you were claiming supernatural powers. You had to respect religious doctrine about what was acceptable. This doesn't mean people didn't use herbs or didn't benefit from them. It means they used them within constraints imposed by a religious authority. In your medieval bed, if you were using an herb for sleep, you might or might not be conscious of these religious constraints. If you were simply burning sage because it helped you sleep, you might not be thinking about the church's position on herb use. But the church's position was there, in the background, creating a context where certain uses were acceptable and others were dangerous. For women especially, this context was important because women's herb use was more likely to be questioned and scrutinised, more likely to seem suspicious, more likely to attract the kind of attention that could lead to witchcraft accusations. Sleep deprivation in medieval times was a real problem, not a metaphorical problem, and understanding this helps us understand why medieval people were so desperate to find solutions and why they were willing to try such strange and dangerous herbs. Modern sleep deprivation is usually temporary. You miss a night of sleep. You're tired the next day. You go back to sleep the next night. But medieval sleep deprivation could be chronic and severe, because the conditions that prevent sleep were built into medieval life. The cold made sleep difficult. The noise, from animals, from other people sharing your space, from environmental sounds, made uninterrupted sleep nearly impossible. The hunger made it hard to sleep comfortably. The anxiety about disease, about violence, about survival, made it hard to relax enough to sleep. And the parasites, the fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other creatures that were literally on and in your body would wake you up constantly from itching. If you were a medieval peasant trying to sleep, you would be cold. Your mattress would be straw, which wouldn't be very insulating. Your blankets would be thin and inadequate. If you were in a group, families often slept together for warmth. You'd be dealing with body heat from multiple people, but also dealing with the physical proximity and the movements of other people disturbing your sleep. If you were alone, you'd be even colder, and the room itself would be damp and cold, since there was no heating except for a fire, and the fire would be in the main room, not the sleeping area. If you were a medieval noble, the situation was better in some ways, better bed, better insulation, probably fewer parasites. But you might also be dealing with the stress and anxiety that came with your position. You might be worried about politics, about land disputes, about succession. Your mind might be too active to sleep even in comfortable conditions, and if you were important enough, you might have ceremonial duties that interrupted your sleep. Formal appearances, religious obligations, social expectations that prevented you from just going to bed and staying there. The chronic sleep deprivation that medieval people experienced was probably affecting their cognition, their mood, their ability to function. Modern studies show that chronic sleep deprivation makes you more anxious, more depressed, less able to think clearly, more prone to making mistakes. Medieval people probably experienced all of these effects, even if they didn't have a medical framework to understand them. The desperation about sleep is evident in the medical texts. Physicians describe insomnia as a serious condition requiring treatment. They recommend multiple approaches, including herbs. They discuss the dangers of untreated insomnia. So while medieval medicine was often ineffective, in this case the physicians' concern about sleep deprivation was appropriate. They were right that it was a serious problem. They just often didn't have effective solutions. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval medical texts describe insomnia as a significant health problem and recommend herbal treatments for it. The frequency with which insomnia is discussed suggests it was a common complaint, affecting people across social classes. A quirky detail. Some medieval medical texts suggest that insomnia could be a sign of supernatural interference, that you couldn't sleep because demons or spirits were bothering you. This medical interpretation reflects a worldview where the supernatural was considered a real health risk. Whether the insomnia was actually demonic or whether it was just regular insomnia, interpreted through a supernatural lens, the result was the same. Desperate medieval people looking for solutions. Historians still argue about how prevalent insomnia actually was in medieval times, versus how much discussion of it in text reflects the bias of educated physicians towards certain problems, but what's clear is that medieval people experienced sleep deprivation and were desperate for solutions. What this means is that the weird herbs, the dangerous herbs, the hallucinogenic herbs, medieval people weren't using them for fun. They were using them because they were desperate. They couldn't sleep because their lives were genuinely difficult and uncomfortable. They were trying to solve a real problem, and they were willing to take risks to do it. The understanding that medieval herb use was driven by genuine desperation rather than curiosity or casual recreation changes how we view it. These weren't people playing with drugs. These were people trying to survive difficult circumstances and using whatever tools they had access to. The fact that some of those tools were dangerous reflects not moral failing on the part of medieval people, but rather the desperation of their circumstances. One more practical purpose of nighttime herb burning that we should address: pest control. Because burning herbs at night wasn't just about sleep. It was also about survival, about keeping your bedroom inhabitable despite the presence of countless parasites that would otherwise eat you alive. Medieval bedrooms were infested. This is not hyperbole. This is documented fact. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, mosquitoes, and various other parasites would live in bedding, in walls, in any available space. They would feed on you at night, causing itching, pain, and infection. They would also transmit diseases. So the problem was not just discomfort, it was health threat. Certain herbs have insecticidal properties. They kill or repel insects. Sage is one, mugwort is another. Wormwood has strong insecticidal properties. When you burned these herbs, the smoke would permeate the room, and the insecticidal compounds in the smoke would irritate and affect the insects. Some insects would die, some would be repelled and would leave the room. The effect would not be complete, you wouldn't eliminate all the parasites. But it would reduce the infestation enough to make the bedroom somewhat more habitable. From a medieval person's perspective, this was crucial. An evening of herb burning might mean fewer bites during the night. Fewer bites meant less itching, less infection risk, less disease transmission. This was actual medical benefit, even if it wasn't a complete solution. So burning these herbs was not just tradition or superstition. It was practical pest control. The experience of this would be something like, you'd prepare your herbs for burning, you'd light them as evening came. The smoke would fill the room with a distinctive smell, sage smoke, or mugwort smoke, or whatever you were using. The smell would be strong enough to be noticeable and unpleasant if you weren't used to it. Then you'd lie down in a room filled with herb smoke. The smoke would irritate your nose and throat slightly. You'd cough a bit, your eyes might water, but simultaneously you'd experience fewer bug bites during the night. You might actually sleep a bit better, not because the herb smoke was making you drowsy, but because you were being bitten less frequently. This dual purpose of herb burning, medicine for sleep plus pest control, is worth dwelling on. Medieval people didn't necessarily separate these purposes. An herb that helped you sleep and also killed parasites was just doubly useful. You were solving multiple problems at once. This made herb burning seem like an especially good idea, even when the smoke was unpleasant. The most insecticidally potent herb would have been wormwood, which has very strong properties against various insects. But wormwood also tastes terrible and smells aggressively bitter, so it might have been reserved for times when the parasites were particularly bad. Sage was more pleasant and more accessible, so it was probably burned more frequently. Mugwort offered a middle ground, effective against parasites, relatively pleasant compared to wormwood, accessible because it grew wild. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Historical medical texts describe the use of certain herbs specifically for their insecticidal properties. The idea that herb smoke could drive away or kill insects was documented and recommended in medieval medical practice. A quirky detail. Some medieval texts described the burning of herbs specifically in bedrooms with an emphasis on the parasites the herb would kill. The terminology suggests that medieval people understood at some level that the herbs were having a direct effect on the insects, not just a spiritual or magical effect. Historians still argue about how effective medieval herb burning actually was for pest control. Modern studies suggest that some herb smoke does have insecticidal properties and could reduce parasite populations, but the effect would be temporary. Insects would return when the smoke cleared, so medieval people were engaged in ongoing pest management, burning herbs repeatedly rather than solving the problem once. What's important is that practical pest control was probably as important a driver of nighttime herb burning as the desire for sleep. A medieval person might burn herbs primarily to reduce parasites, and secondarily hoping it would help them sleep, or they might hope for both effects simultaneously. The goals were complementary enough that there was no need to choose. This combination of sleep aid and pest control probably made herb burning seem like a no-brainer from a medieval perspective. You were solving two real problems. The discomforts of both insomnia and parasites were genuine and severe. Any tool that could address both was valuable, so burning herbs made sense, even when the smoke was unpleasant and even when the effects were incomplete. Now we need to talk about the gap between what medieval medical theory said should work and what actually worked in practice. Because medieval physicians often had explanations for why herbs worked that were completely wrong, even when the herbs actually did work. This disconnect between theory and practice is important for understanding medieval herbalism. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this theory, illness was caused by imbalances in these humours. Treatment involved restoring balance through various means: bloodletting, purging, balancing the diet, and yes, using herbs. According to humoral theory, an herb worked by either increasing or decreasing one of the humours, so mandrake might be understood as cooling and drying, decreasing hot and wet humours, which would balance certain conditions. Mugwort might be understood as warming and moving stagnant humours, and so on. The problem is that this theory is completely wrong. There are no four humours. Imbalance of humours is not the cause of disease. The herbs probably worked, when they did work, for completely different reasons, because they contained psychoactive compounds, because they had antimicrobial properties, because they had sedative effects, because they helped with digestion. But medieval physicians didn't know this. They had an entire framework of explanation that was wrong, even when their treatments produced results. And yet, because of this wrong theory, medieval physicians sometimes recommended herbs in ways that were accidentally correct. They'd recommend a herb for a condition, the herb would help, and they'd conclude that their theory was correct and their understanding was good. But the mechanism of action was completely different from what they thought. They were getting results for the wrong reasons. This meant that medieval medical practice included some good prescriptions mixed with a lot of pseudoscientific reasoning. An apothecary might tell you to use valerian for sleep, and valerian would help you sleep, and you'd think the apothecary was knowledgeable. In fact, the apothecary might be completely confused about why valerian worked, might have been operating on false principles, might recommend valerian for the wrong reasons, but the end result, you sleep better, would be correct. This created a situation where medical authority and actual medical knowledge were not aligned. Someone could be considered a medical authority and be completely wrong about how things worked, even while recommending things that actually did work. Or someone could have better practical knowledge than educated physicians, but less authority, because the educated physicians had credentials and training and theories, even if their theories were wrong. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval medical theory was based on humoral balance, and herb use was explained through this framework. Modern medicine has completely rejected humoral theory, but some of the herb use recommendations that came out of this wrong theory actually did help people, probably for completely different reasons. A quirky detail: some medieval physicians would recommend the same herb for multiple different conditions, because they'd explain the condition through humoral imbalance, and recommend an herb that was understood as correcting that imbalance. But modern understanding might find that the herb actually does help with multiple conditions, but for different pharmacological reasons than humoral theory would suggest. So medieval physicians were sometimes right in practice while being completely wrong in theory. Historians still argue about how much medieval medicine should be credited for getting practical results, even though the theory was wrong. Some argue that getting results through wrong reasoning is less impressive than it sounds. Others argue that if the results were real, the wrong reasoning is irrelevant. The treatment worked, and that's what matters. What this means for nighttime herbalism is that medieval people might have been using herbs effectively without understanding how they worked. You'd be told to burn sage for sleep. The sage would help you sleep. You'd be grateful, and you wouldn't need to understand the mechanism. The sage would work whether or not you understood that it was the thujone and volatile oils affecting your nervous system. You'd just know that the practice had worked for generations and would continue to work for you. This gap between theory and practice is probably why herbal medicine survived and continued to be used even as medical theory evolved. The herbs worked, in many cases, even when the theory explaining them was wrong. So even as Renaissance physicians started questioning humoral theory, they'd still use the same herbs, because the herbs kept producing results. The theory was updated, but the practice continued, because the practice had been validated by actual use. The shift from medieval herbalism to modern medicine is a transition that happened slowly over several centuries, but we can point to the period from roughly the 17th century onward as when things started to fundamentally change. This is when the Industrial Revolution was beginning, when chemistry was becoming a real science, when medicine was being transformed by new understandings of disease and treatment. What changed was partly the tools, microscopes that allowed people to see bacteria, chemical analysis that allowed people to isolate and understand active compounds in plants, controlled experiments that allowed testing of treatments. But what changed was also the frameworks. Germ theory replacing humoral theory, the idea of active chemical compounds replacing the idea of essences and virtues, the reduction of medicine to physical and chemical mechanisms. As these changes happened, herbal medicine went from being the mainstream approach to being marginalized. If you could isolate the active compound in an herb, synthesize it in a laboratory, and give it in a standardized dose, why would you bother with the whole herb, with all its inconsistency and all the compounds you didn't need? Modern medicine extracted the good parts of herbs and threw away the rest. Valerian didn't disappear, but it became a supplement, not a mainstream medical treatment. Chamomile persisted in folk use. Mugwort got forgotten by mainstream medicine, though it's had a bit of a revival in recent years. Mandrake and henbane were deemed too dangerous and were abandoned, except for the extraction of their alkaloid compounds for use in modern medicine. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The transition from herbal medicine to modern pharmaceutical medicine happened from the 17th through 20th centuries, with different regions and different medical systems making this transition at different times. In some places, herbalism was more marginalized than in others. A quirky detail: some pharmaceutical drugs are still derived from plants that medieval herbalists used. Aspirin comes from willow bark. Digitalis, used for heart conditions, comes from foxglove. Anti-malarial drugs are derived from cinchona bark. In a sense, modern medicine is still using plants. It's just extracting and synthesizing the active compounds rather than using the whole plant. Historians still argue about whether the shift from herbal medicine to modern pharmaceuticals was a clear improvement, or whether something was lost in the transition. Some argue that isolated compounds are more effective and safer than whole herbs with variable composition. Others argue that whole herbs may have benefits that isolated compounds lack, and that some of the wisdom of traditional herbalism was lost. What's clear is that for nighttime sleep aids, the shift was dramatic. Medieval and early modern people were burning herbs, making herbal teas, taking herbal preparations. By the 20th century, people were taking pharmaceutical sleep medications, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, modern sleep aids. The practice shifted from herbal plant material to synthesized chemicals. The experience shifted from smoke and tea to pills. The understanding of what was happening shifted from essences and humoral balance to brain chemistry and neurotransmitter effects. And yet, despite this shift, herbal sleep remedies never entirely disappeared. They persisted in folk medicine, in alternative medicine, in places where modern medicine was not accessible or trusted. And in recent decades they've experienced a revival. People buying valerian, chamomile, mugwort and other herbs specifically for sleep, sometimes framing this as a return to natural remedies, sometimes just as an alternative to pharmaceutical drugs. And so here we are, in the modern day, and despite everything that's changed, despite our understanding of pharmacology, despite the availability of pharmaceutical sleep aids, despite the decline of herbal medicine in mainstream practice, we're seeing a return to some of the same herbs medieval people used. Not quite for the same reasons and not quite in the same way, but the plants themselves are coming back. You can walk into a modern health food store and buy valerian root, and the reasons you might buy it are not so different from the reasons a medieval person might burn it. You can't sleep. You want a solution that feels more natural or less risky than pharmaceutical drugs. You trust plants more than pharmaceuticals. The herbs are the same. Your need is the same. Some of the explanations are different. We'd say valerian affects your nervous system through specific compounds rather than correcting humoral imbalance. But the end result is the same. You're trying herbs to help you sleep. Mugwort is experiencing a minor resurgence in modern spiritual and wellness communities, with people using it specifically for dreams, for lucid dreams, which is exactly what medieval people were using it for. Chamomile continues to be widely used and widely recommended, just as it was in medieval times. Even mandrake has found its way into modern alternative medicine, though the danger is perhaps better understood now. Sage burning has transformed into the practice of smudging, which involves burning sage or similar plants for spiritual or purification purposes. This is often presented as a Native American practice, which is accurate, but it's also continuing a tradition that medieval Europeans were engaging in and that cultures around the world were engaging in. The practice of burning plant material for spiritual and practical purposes is deeply human and deeply old. So we're living in an interesting moment where modern science has displaced herbal medicine from the mainstream, but where herbal medicine is now being revived, partly on the grounds that it's more natural, partly because it's available and accessible, partly because people are skeptical of pharmaceutical drugs, and partly because, well, some of these herbs actually do work, and modern science has confirmed that they work, which validates centuries of folk use. The cycle is interesting. Medieval people used herbs, didn't understand how they worked, had wrong theories but sometimes right practices. Modern science marginalized the herbs, developed pharmaceuticals. Modern people, skeptical of pharmaceuticals or wanting natural solutions, returned to the herbs. Modern science, with its current understanding of plant chemistry, now validates many of the herbs that medieval people were using. We've come full circle, but with better understanding of the mechanisms. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Herbal remedies for sleep and other conditions, including many that were used in medieval times, remain in use in the 21st century, and some are validated by modern scientific research. A quirky detail. The modern wellness trend of herbal supplements has created a huge market where people can buy essentially the same plant materials that medieval people were using, but in convenient forms. You can buy chamomile tea bags, you can buy valerian root in capsules, you can buy mugwort in dried form or in tinctures. Medieval herbalism is accessible to modern people in a way it never was before. Historians and scientists are now validating medieval herbalism in interesting ways, confirming that many herbs medieval people used actually do have the properties medieval people attributed to them, even if the theory medieval people used to explain those properties was wrong. This retroactive validation is satisfying. Medieval people were right about the practice, even if they were wrong about the mechanism. What all of this suggests is that herbalism is not a quaint historical practice that we've outgrown. It's a practice that persists, that continues to be relevant, that cycles in and out of favour but never entirely disappears. Medieval people burning herbs in their bedrooms at night were engaging in a practice that's still around, still used, still giving people hope for better sleep. And now we're going to drift towards sleep ourselves. The images of medieval bedrooms filled with smoke, the strange plants that made medieval people see things, the desperate herbalists trying to solve real problems with the tools they had. All of these are fading into the background now. The pacing is slowing. The thoughts are becoming softer. You're feeling heavier, as if the weight of the night is settling over you like a blanket. The distinction between waking and sleeping is becoming blurry. You've been on a journey through medieval nights, through the plants that medieval people burned, through the hopes and fears and desperate attempts to find rest. And now, like them, like all of us, you're drifting towards sleep. The story is ending. Your eyes are heavy, your mind is quiet. And somewhere in the darkness a medieval person is burning herbs, hoping for sleep, just as humans have always hoped, just as you're hoping now. The night is long and old, and sleep is calling. Let yourself drift. The herbs are burning, the smoke is rising, and somewhere between the medieval past and the modern present, the